This is an encounter I experienced in the summer of 2009. I was born and raised in the plains of Texas, specifically in an area where black-eyed kids' sightings are prevalent. I had heard the stories, tales, legends, whatever you want to call them, since I was a young man, but never truly believed them. The black-eyed kids were mainly something I entertained as a joke, or something to get a rise out of people. This changed in the summer of 2009. It was a warm night in June. I was up late, around 2 a.m., as I typically like to stay up late, especially in the summer since it would be fairly warm even after the sun went down. I had just run up to the store to grab a big fountain drink and was returning into my house through the back door when I was approached by two kids, a boy and a girl. I was very startled once I realized that they were there, since I wasn't expecting to encounter anyone in my backyard so late at night. The little boy asked, "Could we come in? We need to use the phone, we're lost." This is when I noticed the blackness of their eyes. Both of them so dark, they were like pits. This is also when my heart sank. I couldn't believe I was actually seeing them, that they were there, right in front of me. As I mentioned before, I had heard the legends of the black-eyed children most of my life, so there was no way I was going to let them in my house. I darted inside and locked the back door as quickly as I could. Once I was in, I ran upstairs and flipped on the lights to try and see if they were still outside. Thankfully, by then, they were gone. I had so much adrenaline pumping by that point, though, that I grabbed a weapon and began searching the house and making sure all doors and windows were locked. It took me hours to get to sleep that night, and it's an encounter that will stay with me for the rest of my life. These entities took the form of something most people view as innocent, weak, mild, and try to trick unsuspecting people and do God knows what with or to them. I'm just glad my reflexes kicked in and I was able to live to tell the tale. I'm going to preface this post by saying that paranormal experiences are not unknown to me. I have seen ghosts many times over my life, and my mom claims to have seen me playing with them as a child. She was a psychic medium, so I spent a good deal of my childhood around this stuff, but those experiences are for another time. This is just to assure you that I have had experiences with the paranormal before, and that what I experienced I consider to be abnormal generally, as most of my experiences up until now have been positive, or at least neutral. This was a few years ago in my very early 20s. I'm in my mid to late 20s now. I haven't had any paranormal experiences since a little while after my mom passed away when I was a teenager. I was starting to think the things I had experienced didn't happen at all. General denial. One night, on a whim, while driving around a suburb near my house, I managed to convince my boyfriend to come with me to the local cemetery. I was going through a bit of an edgy phase and thought that going to a graveyard at night would be cool. This is a cemetery in a big city, and it's extremely large. I didn't believe in ghosts hanging around in a cemetery, so I thought that it would be fine. I believed that ghosts usually hung around the places that they died, or places where they had unfinished business, and that it was very unlikely that they would actually be in a graveyard. It was sometime in October, but not Halloween. We got to the cemetery around 11:30 p.m. We had our phones with us and were using them as torches. We hopped the fence to the cemetery and began to look at all the graves, pointing out the most interesting ones and kind of just messing around. The place was completely deserted, as cemeteries tend to be at that time of night. We walked further and further in and entered a part of the cemetery where the graves were quite a bit larger and much older. By now it had likely been around half an hour. As we were walking down the path, my boyfriend commented that there was a strange smell lingering around, which was extremely weird, as my boyfriend cannot smell at all. He lost his sense of smell due to a bunch of infections and other problems with his ears and sinuses as a kid. I couldn't smell anything, and I have an above average sense of smell, so we both just shrugged the experience off as just weird. Later on, I was looking at one of the graves when my boyfriend shook my shoulder and pointed at one of the largest graves a few meters into the distance. I'm terrible at knowing where people are pointing, but this time, I spotted it right away. It was a little girl, I'd guess around 11 or 12 years old. She had very dark brown or black hair that looked well cared for and quite long. She was sitting on top of the grave, with her legs dangling over the edge. At first I saw her wearing a lacy white dress, like a nightgown that a rich girl might wear. It looked old, but I'm no expert, so I couldn't tell you exactly how old, but maybe the 1900s, early 1900s? I looked away to look at my boyfriend, and when I looked back, she was wearing a different dress. All I remember is that it was red, because at this point I was super scared. Something about the entire situation felt wrong to me. I felt extremely fearful, and due to the fact that ghosts were very normal for me, this was extremely unusual. I would never feel unsafe seeing a ghost in the past. It was around this time that I noticed that the cemetery was eerily quiet. There were no sounds of bats, and there were a lot of fruit bats in that area. There were no other sounds of animals, and the air felt stale and stagnant. We just stood and stared at the little girl for what felt like an eternity, weirdly transfixed, and then we both ran for it up the path at full speed. I turned for a second to see if she was still there, and she was gone completely. It made me run faster, honestly, and the whole time we were both dead silent. When we got back to our car, we sat there for ages trying to work out what we had just witnessed. We were trying to rationalize it, but as we have both had paranormal experiences before, we knew it had to be a ghost. For a few months afterward, I felt continuously like I was being watched, and had frequent nightmares about seeing the little girl in our apartment. I always felt uneasy. We eventually moved around 30 minutes away, and the feelings and the dreams stopped. I've since tried to research the ghost, but haven't had anything turn up, though there is a local ghost tour at the cemetery, and maybe the guide might know something. Ever since then, my paranormal experiences have been more frequent, and have been getting more unsettling and disturbing. My boyfriend has been experiencing things more frequently as well. I have a story of the first time that I saw a ghost in full body manifestation. It was to the point where they looked human. I've had other encounters and experiences before, and all were shadowy horrors, but not this ghost. It almost felt like a guardian angel, so this was very strange. When I was baptized, I was told to walk into the back area of the stage where I would wait to make my entrance into the baptismal pool. As I opened the door from the back area, I was greeted by a guy who was wearing a Hawaiian shirt and a straw fedora, holding a towel. He was just sitting there on a wooden box with a cane. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but then I realized that he was sitting at least 3 feet from the ground with his feet in the air. I figured that he must have been a spry old man, but at the same time I was confused as to why he was holding a cane in the first place. He handed me the towel and told me not to worry and not to be nervous. It was very warming and relaxing hearing him tell me that. Afterwards, I heard the cue for my name and went out, and I was baptized. When I was done changing, I walked into my minister's office and asked who the guy was. She had no idea who I was talking about, but as she said that, I immediately noticed a portrait on the wall of the man who had given me the towel. In the portrait, he was wearing a suit instead, but the face was definitely the same. I pointed at the photo and said, "Him. Who's that guy? Is he the chairman of the board?" She said, "No, he's a founding member of this church. He He passed away a long time ago. I was so baffled. I told her it had to have been him, that it had just happened no less than 20 minutes ago. I went back to the place where he was, and there was a shelf of blankets and towels sitting on top of the box that he was sitting on. All I could think of in total shock was that there was no way that old man had propped that up there by himself in the last 15 minutes, and I quickly prayed and thanked him. After that, I've never had a similar experience. I still only ever encounter negative energy-driven entities in shadows, not pure ones, like him. I've always had some kind of interest in the paranormal. As someone who grew up in a religious household but has always struggled with the concept of faith, I think what's always drawn me to it is the idea of proof. Proof of something beyond this life. Proof that death isn't the end. So I guess that's what set me up for this experience. This was 4-ish years ago on an October night. This happened with 2 friends of mine who I'll call Jim and Lisa. I've known Jim since 2nd grade, and Lisa since high school. Lisa and I went to the same college for a bit, and we had a mutual interest in the paranormal. Given the time of year that it was, close to Halloween, we decided to go and do some ghost hunting of our own. I called up Jim, who also had some interest, and planned to meet up and drive to a local cemetery not far from where we were. So this place definitely has the spooky factor to it. It's on a residential road, but the section the cemetery is in is really wooded and separated from everything. It's set back on a hill, and carved into the hillside right up against the road are the keeps that they used to lay bodies out in when the ground was too frozen to do burials back in the day. Jim and I had scoped this place out during the summer during the day because it was close to where he lived, so I kinda knew the layout. We all met up and parked next to it. I had brought a voice recorder from school. I worked at the school radio station, so it was fairly nice. We started walking around and asked some innocuous questions. Lisa claims to be sensitive, which I'm skeptical of, but that will come into play a little later. As we were walking around, kind of creeped out, we walked toward the back of the cemetery. It goes fairly far back, so we were poking around reading stones with flashlights when Lisa and I could swear that we heard someone walking around near the middle of the cemetery. All 3 of us were together near the back, and there was 1000% not anyone else out there. Could it have been some college kids hyping themselves up? Maybe. It's hard for me to really confirm with hindsight whether we were being overly imaginative, but we were pretty sketched out. After about 15 to 20 minutes, we figured that we should pack it up. Lisa and I were kind of freaked out still because we were fairly convinced that something was walking around near the center of those headstones. She also kept saying that she felt like something was compelling us to leave, and that we weren't welcome. Jem was kind of indifferent and wasn't really noticing anything super crazy, so we started making our way down the hill. This is when a weird thing happened. As we were walking down the hill, I heard a stone skip past me as if someone had kicked or thrown it. I figured that it was just Jem, as he's apt to do that sort of thing. But as I looked and was about to say something to him, he was about 10 feet to my left. He definitely didn't kick anything at me. The weirdest stuff that we found was on the recorder when we got back. I want to make this clear, this was not a super windy night. There was a light breeze at best. But the recorder sounded like it was windy as hell because we caught a ton of what I call interference. It was really deep bass tones that sounded like the microphone on the recorder were being overloaded. The creepy part was that there were times where there was a rhythmic quality to it, like something was speaking but couldn't get through fully. I'd say it sounds like when someone's talking in another room with the door shut, where you can hear the noise, but not much in the way of actual words. I did get it on the other investigations with this recorder, but never at that level. So while it's possible that it could have been an issue with the recorder, I'm not entirely sure. We also got some really direct, creepy EVPs. Toward the end of our time there, you can hear me on the recorder saying, "Hey guys, we should go," in reference to the creepy walking sounds from the middle of the cemetery. During the discussion from the three of us, there's a moan that's pretty audible that no one heard while we were there. It sounded like something was upset that we were leaving. This was reinforced by a minute later when Lisa asked, "Do you want us to leave or do you want us to stay?" And a voice pretty clearly answered, "Stay. I want you to stay," which was creepy enough to hear in general, but the whispery quality to it makes the hair raise up on the back of my neck. The epilogue to this is Lisa claimed that there was weird stuff happening all around her house the weekend after we went. Banging on the wall, noises in the other rooms. Full disclosure, Lisa does have a bit of history with mental illness, so I guess you might could chalk it up to that. The part that gives me pause is that we were talking about this at school one day and her sister called from the house complaining about all the weird crap that was happening. While I think her sister also has some sort of history, I think it's mostly anxiety-based, but I'm not 100% sure honestly. I do find it a stretch that her sister would call and make a big deal out of it if stuff wasn't legitimately taking place. I only wish that I'd gone to the house and experienced whatever it was firsthand just to see for myself. It was my last year of college, and after getting dumped by my first significant girlfriend the year before, I ended up involved with a woman who lived next door. It was not a healthy relationship for either of us, but I think we cared for each other despite not always being good to each other, and we somehow stayed involved for like a year. One morning while we were brushing our teeth and getting ready for the day at her place, she mentioned a video assignment due in a couple of days. She grew up in a large city and was unfamiliar with the sleepy New England region that we went to college in, but she knew that I had gone to high school about an hour away and had family in the area, so she was hoping that I might be able to suggest somewhere interesting to get footage. I suggested that my parents were buried in a pretty cemetery near the high school in town, and that I hadn't stopped to pay my respects for a bit, so I'd be happy to drive her over there after classes. She liked the idea, and we agreed to meet up in the afternoon, grab some dinner, and go by the graveyard so that she could take her footage. Only we kind of screwed up. It was probably late fall by that point, and the days were getting noticeably shorter. If I remember right, service was slow at the restaurant too. By the time we were getting into my hand-me-down Dodge Grand Caravan to head out to the graveyard, the sun was going down. Not ideal for shooting some quick, amateur footage for video class. As I said, the graveyard was near the high school, which was a little outside the town proper. You passed the school, and then there was this windy road kind of into the woods and up a sizable hill or small mountain overlooking their football field. About halfway up, there was a turn off into the cemetery. It was a peaceful little spot, and my grandparents had plots next to each other. I had visited a lot in the daytime in my first couple of years of college. My grandmother had passed away when I was in high school, but my grandfather lived on a few more years until passing away early into my first years of college. Since I was nearby, I visited him a fair bit as his health began to decline, and in retrospect, I really value those opportunities to spend some one-on-one time with him, even if I feel a little guilty for not appreciating it at the time. I was a snotty 19-year-old and didn't realize what a cool guy that he actually was, and how lucky that I was to be part of his life in that way. After he died, I continued to stop by the cemetery several times a year to check on their grave sites and pay my respects. I had been to the cemetery a lot, but never after sundown. There were two entrances. The main one that took you through the center of the graveyard, and a side entrance that led out onto a little road, just big enough for one car that was a straight shot to my grandparents' plots. To the left of this little gravel road was an open field with newer-looking graves, and to the right was a more overgrown area with older-looking headstones, and the real tree line for the woods beyond that. Even in daytime, because of the brush and the shade from the trees, it always looked dim off that way, and my sister and I had both remarked about how it was kind of creepy over there. So this woman I was seeing and I were driving to the cemetery at sundown, just hoping that we'd be able to get in and figure out how to get some footage for her assignment. The main gate was locked, but the side entrance was open, which was better for us anyways, since it was the more direct route to my grandparents' graves. I pulled the minivan in slowly, careful to stay off the grass as much as possible, and we stopped and got out at the intersection nearest to where my grandparents were buried. She got the camera she had checked out from the school's library equipment room, and was trying to get some footage of the headstones or something while I walked over to say hi to my grandparents. Only it was too dark, and after a couple of minutes she asked if I would turn the headlights on to see if the light would help her get something usable. Not knowing how long we'd be out there, and not wanting to drain the battery, I decided to just go ahead and turn on the engine too. After a few more minutes, the van started acting weird. It wasn't a new vehicle. My parents had bought it before I was in high school and had given it to me years before, so I was pretty familiar with the sound of the engine idling. That night in the graveyard, the engine began to make unfamiliar noises. It was very high-pitched and loud for an idling vehicle. That immediately raised concern for me because the last thing that I wanted was for the van to break down in the middle of the cemetery where we may or may not have been trespassing. I started to walk back toward the van to investigate. As I walked toward it, though, the headlights began to flicker rapidly. It was sort of an inconsistent strobing effect, which was like a what the heck kind of thing. They had never done that before, and never did it after. Same with the engine noise. Then I heard something even more disturbing. To my side, off in the wooded area with the older graves, something started moving around in the brush. I looked, and in the darkness, I swear, I saw movement to accompany the sound. I couldn't see what it was too dark, but something was coming slowly towards us out of those woods. I instantly felt as if it was time to go, and that we shouldn't be there. Fortunately, my companion agreed, even though she hadn't got enough footage, because she heard the approaching rustling as well. We got into the van, which continued to sound really weird, but thankfully it went into gear and drove normally as we got the hell out of there. The lights stopped flickering as I got turned around, and the engine sound returned to normal as we approached the gate. The most rational explanation for the rustling was an animal, but that didn't explain the van acting so strangely. I kept it for another 6 months before trading it in, and it never made noise like that while idling again, and the headlights were always reliable, never flickering. I also have had other strange experiences in my life, but this was the first and only time I ever felt that overwhelming sense that I had to leave or that I shouldn't be somewhere. I can't help but wonder if both my sister and I had always thought that wooded spot off to the right was spooky for a good reason, and if I might have found out what that reason was had my companion and I stayed for a few more minutes that night. I'm 90% sure that the church I work at is haunted. I work in the church nursery, to be specific, which is part of the original church, which was built in the early 50s. They now have a detached main building for the adults, and my building is the youth and nursery building. The church also owns a house right next door that was built in the 60s, maybe the 70s, which the youth leader gets to live in. I've been working in the nursery alone for almost 4 years now. I also babysit the kids of the youth pastor in their house next door. At the nursery we have mainly very old toys made in the 70s that somehow still manage to work. I've never even replaced the batteries in these toys. After Sunday school, everyone in my building except me and my kids move over to the service building, so the kids and I are completely alone. I only have 2 kids at a time since we are a very small church. Without fail, at 11 a.m. every Sunday when youth leaves the building, I will have the same 3 toys randomly start making noises. I know the kids aren't the ones making them go off, since at 11 we have snack time, so we're all at the table. At first I thought I was crazy, as it would only ever happen while I was alone with the kids. Until last year, that is. Last year we got a new pastor, and his wife decided that she was going to work in the nursery with me since the youth pastor had a newborn. We wanted extra help just in case we had a situation go down that required 2 people. Well, the toys began going off with her present as well. She didn't seem to think anything of it. Once the pandemic started, she no longer works with me, and I'm alone watching just one toddler. When it's just us, I'll hear talking, footsteps, and doors opening or closing. I don't normally feel any bad vibes coming from whatever is in the church, though, so I leave it be. Now let's talk about the house next door that the church owns. This house, I actually am slightly scared of. Things are always falling and breaking in that house. The first thing that comes to mind is 2 years ago. The kids and I were in the living room playing, and all of a sudden we heard the sound of glass breaking. We searched the house and found that all of the light bulbs in the bathroom were shattered. I freaked out to say the least, but apparently stuff like that happens all the time over there. Another time, I was changing the baby's diaper in his room. He has sliding doors on his closet. He was fussy, so I was singing to him when all of a sudden I was hit from behind. His closet door somehow fell on me. I put his door back up and into the brackets, and maybe an hour later we went back to his room to get his shoes so we could go play outside. As we were making our way past the closet door whilst leaving, the door nearly fell on the baby. Thankfully, my reflexes were quick enough that it landed against my arm instead, bruising me pretty good. I told his parents and got a very nonchalant, weird. Then comes to last night. I was bathing my 4-year-old son, along with a 1-year-old, while everyone else was next door at the church. All of a sudden, a canvas picture frame fell off the wall in the hallways closest to the bathroom. I'm pretty freaked out. I fixed the picture and got the kids out of the bath. As I was trying to get the 1-year-old ready for bed, he wouldn't stop shaking, crying, and looking into the corner of his room by his closet. He was absolutely terrified. I have never seen this baby so frightened. He's usually really very happy all the time. We immediately left the room, left the light on, and went into the living room with one of the other kids. I told his parents again, and they just said, "Yeah, it happens sometimes." I'm starting to get worried, and I'm afraid to go to work. I work either at the church or at their house at least 4 days a week, sometimes more. I'm starting to no longer feel safe. The dream I just had was one of the most prophetic that I have ever had. I have gotten into the habit of listening to historical documentaries while I sleep, and one of them just made its way into my dream. Let me explain. I was sitting on a bed in a broken-down old house when I started hearing an animal screaming in pain outside. I run to the window, and I see an older man, and who I can only assume is his wife outside this house, with a strongly malnourished panther that is on the ground in front of them. The older man has a whip, and is raising it up before I yell to stop, and the panther jumps up, climbs up the side of the wall to my window, and the large jungle cat climbs inside. I start to close the window, and the man starts to scream to give me his animal back to him. I only flip him the bird, and then turn to help the animal. I leave to go get some meat and a bed and whatever else I think the animal might need when I get back. It's nighttime. I walk back in, and I see the panther laying with his head on my pillow, asleep. I turn around to put the stuff down and close the door, and when I turn back, he's sitting up, staring at me. I apologize to him for waking him up, and I show him the meat. I tell him that I don't want him chewing on me next time he gets hungry, and he says, "I couldn't." At this point, I'm completely caught off guard, and I just stare at him. He continued, "You saved me. I would never eat you. My name is Ramses." I smile at him and introduce myself while placing the meat in front of him. As he finishes up, he looks up at me and says, "Thank you. I wish I could be here on happier terms, but I have a message about this world and all of its humans. This world will have to face judgment in an endless desert. So much was given, and so much was ruined. Now there will be nothing. I'm sorry." I let him know that I understood, and I thank him for his message. Suddenly, the house around me begins to shake and crumble. Just before a large piece of wall falls on me, I wake up. I only know this story because it was told to me by a family member. I don't have much recollection of it myself. When I was younger, my mom ran an old people's home, so we lived there and I knew a lot of the people who also lived there. When I was about 4 or 5, my family and I used to love going to visit different towns and cities, check out all the landmarks. I can't remember which town it was, but we visited the church there. We were just having a look around, as you do, when suddenly as I was looking across the pews, I saw a lady. She was just sitting there, not bothering anyone at all, but apparently I burst out crying and started begging to leave. Once we got out, I'm told I kept saying that it was one of the ladies who lived in the home that my mom ran. The issue was, she had died a few weeks prior. None of my family ever saw her. The only thing I remember properly is seeing her and just being absolutely terrified. I have no idea why, but I do remember the fear itself. It was real and very intense. I still see things on occasion. Sometimes the fear is there, sometimes it isn't. The story I'm about to tell happened when I was little, so basically it's my mother's and my uncle's version of it. When I was 4 years old, I was really sick. I basically couldn't digest the food that I ate, so my body had no defenses. I even spent weeks in intensive care at the hospital. The thing is, nobody knew what was wrong with me. For a year, 3 different doctors were trying to figure out what was happening. They made me do a lot of tests, even for rare conditions, but they were always negative. My mom was completely desperate. In her own words, "You were gonna die before I could even figure out what was taking you away." One day, my mom was with me at my uncle's house. He's my dad's brother, and he lives with his wife and the mom of his wife, who was like a grandmother to me. So this old woman told my mom that she was beginning to think that I was possessed by a spirit. I live in a place with a lot of esoteric beliefs and traditions, especially followed by the old people. She asked my mother if she remembered going to the cemetery while she was pregnant with me. At that moment, my mother remembered that she had gone to bring flowers to her father's grave on the day of All Saints. There's a legend here that if you go to the cemetery while you're pregnant, or with a newborn baby, the spirits will try to possess it so that they can get to live again. My mom and uncle threw me into the car to take me to a church known for such cases. They said that I was screaming and crying the whole way in the back of the car. "Let me get out, I don't want to go there." I didn't even know where we were going, or why, since they didn't tell me anything. My uncle was driving, and suddenly, we hit a traffic jam. He tried to slow down the car, and then he realized that the brakes weren't responding. He kept stepping on the brakes without the car responding until we were about to hit the car that was standing right in front of us. All of this happened in a matter of seconds. Then the car stopped completely, just inches away from colliding. When we were sitting still, the strangest thing of the trip happened. They both felt as if several people from the outside of the car were pushing the car, shaking it to one side and the other. I was still screaming. Long story short, we arrived to the church. I didn't want to come in, but I finally did. I was crying all the time. When we got out, I was in a much better mood. My mom bought me donuts on our way to the car. I ate one and then puked, but it was as if I had puked up something with sandy texture. Something completely dry. My uncle stopped the car and got me out in case I was going to keep getting sick. Suddenly, I did a strange sound. It was like a burp, but way too loud and deep sounding for a small 4-year-old kid. Since the pandemic, the church my parents attend has been recording their Sunday morning worship earlier in the week, and then the minister will edit and publish it on social media on the actual service day. This past Wednesday, we recorded the worship music. I'm one of the 3 singers that we have, and my mom is the pianist. While in the middle of recording our first song, we all hear a man yell, "Stop." I look over in the direction that it came from, somewhere off stage to my left. See nothing, and then we just finish up the song. After we finish the song, one of the other singers goes, "Did you hear that?" All 5 of us, including our other instrumentalist, my mom, and the 3 singers, all said yes. The saxophone player was suggesting that it was a wrong note that we had played, or possibly a weird squeak as the building settled. None of us were really convinced, though. Fast forward to this Sunday. My mom and I watched the service and realized that the noise couldn't have been from the sax because the sax has a microphone and would have been very audible on the video. We noticed where the 2 of us looked over at the noise, and we even replayed that section a couple of times with the volume raised. Both of us could hear it, just barely, beneath the sound of the music. This was by far the freakiest thing that I have ever experienced in that church, and none of us will ever be finding ourselves alone in that building again. I live near one of the oldest cemeteries in Portland, Oregon. It's pioneer era. The oldest graves are from the 1850s, and it's still active today, funerals all the time. Anyway, I go walk and jog through there pretty often. I usually jog a couple miles, and then finish up with some wind sprints. There's a spot where it's straight for about 60 or 70 yards, so I'll do 8 or 10 of these things and then quit. The spot where I usually start running from is right near the grave of a young boy who was born in 1896 and died in 1902. I've done some research, and all of his family is actually buried in a different cemetery, so I always feel a little sad about it. His name is Carl, and it's weird maybe, but I talk to the kid's grave as I'm resting up between sprints. For whatever reason, that's the only grave in there that I've ever paid much attention to, and about the only one that I'd ever done any research on. Not sure why exactly. A couple weeks ago on Wednesday, I was doing my thing. I stopped at my normal spot, said hi to Carl, and instantly got this sickening feeling that I was in danger. I looked up at this tree, big old oak, branches around 1.5 feet in diameter. I was absolutely terrified, and I started running and got the hell out of the way. I was absolutely 100% sure that this branch was going to fall and kill me. I waited a few minutes, and came back over and started looking at this big oak tree and the horse chestnut right beside it. I couldn't decide which tree actually was going to fall, so I sort of blew it off as paranoia. Not really a credible premonition or whatever. The next day, on Thursday, I go for a run, avoiding that area. When I finished up, I went back and stopped next to Carl's grave. It was a little later than I usually go, mid-afternoon, and it's getting pretty hot out, so I wasn't really looking forward to running more. I didn't actually hear anything, but something told me you shouldn't go any further. So it's hot, I'm tired, I'm paranoid. I noped out and went home. The next day, it's Friday. I go back into the cemetery. A massive branch from the oak tree had fallen, knocked about 5 branches off of the horse chestnut. It all landed on Carl's grave and right on the part of the path that I usually jog on. Some parks workers were already cutting the trees up to clear the way. I asked one guy when it had fallen, and he said it had happened sometime on Thursday afternoon. I have no idea if I actually would have been there at that time at that spot, but it was weird enough to freak me out a little bit. Anyway, thanks, Carl. Last night was awfully weird. I was in my childhood home, but at my current age. As I opened the door to my grandmother's room, it suddenly swung back and forth while my hands were still holding it from the side, not the doorknob, and it pulled me forcefully into the room and onto the floor. I felt a cold sweat coming on, but suddenly realized that I had to toughen up and shake it off. I screamed something like, "This is my house! You have no right to scare me! How dare you!" over and over again. I came close to the door and would hear a faint, high-pitched, distorted, tee-hee kind of laugh. Then I woke up. I thought it was already around 6 a.m. because that's usually the time when my alarm goes off. As I grabbed my phone, I was surprised to see that the time was actually 3:07 a.m. I already felt partially awake, as anyone who wakes up at 6 a.m. would. Now I have to force myself back to sleep or I'll feel awful in the morning. I play some ambient sleep sounds from Alexa while I observe the room, anxiously expecting something out of the ordinary, but nothing happened. I fell back asleep, and in my next dream, I was at a hospital with a group of people that I don't know, but somewhere we were grouped together. There's about 5 or 6 of us in a room, with a dead person in the bed, covered with a sheet. As I left the room, I saw 2 more of the people in our group suddenly appear in a different room, somewhat helping each other put another dead body into a hospital bed while the family weeps. I went back to see the rest of the group in the original room, trying to position the dead body to sit up. The dead guy is of mixed Chinese descent, a bit overweight, and bald. Then some information came into my head that he used to own a restaurant or a bar. As they move his torso upwards, they failed, and the dead body dropped onto the floor. This is when things start to get really weird, because the dead guy woke up like he was startled from his sleep. He stood up and started chasing us, accusing us of killing him. His bowels were a mess, and I could see a stab wound on his belly and on his lower back. I ran away in a long corridor and found myself in the nurse's changing room. It had open cubicles like the ones from football players' dressing rooms, with scrubs and casual clothes alike hanging on the wall. I was partially covered in the dead guy's bodily fluids, so I washed up. Then a nurse found me. I looked terrified of what happened, so I explained the situation to her and led her to that room. The nurse came in and started to comfort the dead guy. He began to calm down and sat beside the nurse, then closed his eyes. The nurse looked at me, and without talking, some information came into my mind. I learned that he was a hopeless case, so they just let him lie down until he dies, as he was already in the process of dying when we startled him. After that moment, I woke up, and this time it was truly 6 a.m., 6:30-ish already. I didn't feel any dread as you would in a nightmare. I did a bit of research on dream meanings, but I felt that it didn't fit with me. Then I found out the significance of 3:07 a.m. from the movie The Conjuring, so I thought the exact time was just a coincidence, since it's just a movie. I could not remember the last time I woke up in the middle of the night. It would be very, very rare that it's not worth remembering. But waking up at 3 a.m. with 2 weird dreams will definitely stay with me forever. Years ago, during a church event that I was forced to attend, we all had a terrifying experience. The setup was that boys slept anywhere they wanted to downstairs, and the girls were free to sleep wherever they wanted to upstairs. Some rooms were locked off, however, as the church was being renovated at the time. Anyway, it didn't matter too much, because we were just a small group. Night rolled around and us girls migrated into the nursery while most of the guys crashed in the indoor gym/basketball court. Only one guy couldn't sleep. Above the basketball court are windows to another room that was locked off, and the guy kept seeing flashing lights as well as the silhouettes of people looking at him. He didn't stay in the gym for very long. About the same time, myself and the other girls were still in the nursery. At that moment, we were playing apples to apples. The door was closed, and next to it was a one-way window. Inside was like a mirror. It was so that kids didn't see their parents coming to check on them and make a fuss. Well, I started hearing banging and scratching on the door. I freaked out and looked up to see two grinning faces staring back at all of us. Remember, we were on the mirror side of the one-way window. One of us bolted toward the door, and we heard stomping down the hall, but no one was there. The pastor came up screaming at us, saying that we were all just imagining things. We know what we saw, though, as well as heard, and all of us refuse to go back. Moving from a small town to a large city at a fairly young age had to be one of the biggest adjustments I've ever had to make. I knew no one. I had no idea how different it really was. I had no reason to think about it before we had to move. Not only was the way of life much different, but so were the people and the experiences. There were so many more buildings, cars, and people in general. And the dangers that lurked only just began to come so real for me. I've always had strange things happen to me that couldn't be explained, but I would always just shrug them off. I would play it off as if I was just tired most times and making myself see things that were not really there. Besides, I had no one to talk to about these strange encounters, and I was a young teenager. Who would really believe these outrageous things that I would just seemingly come up with? The church-going family that we were just wouldn't allow for such nonsense. The Lord protects us from all evil, that kind of jazz. On moving to the city, I eventually got settled after some time of rebelling. I was your normal, typical teenager, and I was angry because I felt like I had been made to leave my friends behind. I got into a lot of trouble and fell into all the wrong crowds. The whole stereotypes that people have of teenagers. I seemed to allow myself to live up to that stereotypical standard. I knew that what I was doing was wrong, but I didn't care. I found myself in some sticky situations that finally led me to a friend that showed me that what I was doing wasn't getting me anywhere with my life. For this story, we'll call him Bob. Bob was an older man. He was, I would say, at least 12 years older than I was. I was 13 at the time that we met. He had moved in downstairs from us with a friend of his that my parents knew. We met while helping his friend move furniture out of his apartment to have his carpets cleaned. Fast forward some time and Bob and I became close friends. Yes, it was odd myself being friends with someone so much older than I was, but somehow it worked at the time. There was this cemetery that was up the street from our apartment complex. We would go there regularly to visit graves and help clean them and place flowers on those that were unmarked to show that someone still cared for these people. We would always go during the day. It was such a beautiful and peaceful place. There were many rose bushes, green grass, tall shrubs, and some really pretty water fountains spread out across this large piece of land. It was easy to just stroll around there all day and lose track of time completely. One day we came upon this one tall mass grave that was unmarked. It was so old that the headstone was crumbling, and the lot that it was on was caving in and had a hole about a foot or so deep just underneath the concrete slab. We were both curious about it and would visit the grave a few times this one week. We weren't sure what it was about this grave that drew us back to it each time, but we visited this person quite often. I can recall this time that we had gone later in the day. It was just an hour or so until it got dark. We were never there when it was dark because they locked the gates, and if they found you there after a certain time, they would kick you out. But they never saw us or bothered to tell us to leave. We were, of course, at this unmarked grave once again. Nighttime had finally fallen, and it was pretty dark. There were a few lights in the cemetery, but it was just a soft glow that filled the area we happened to be at. Bob and I wandered around that unmarked grave, and were admiring the other headstones around it. We just couldn't believe how old that they actually were. We ended up circling back, getting ready to head home. We walked back past the unmarked grave to say goodbye. I remember standing there on the side of the grave, where the hole was. I was just thinking, how could they not fix this, and wondered how far down that it went. Being the curious idiot that I was, I kneeled down next to this hole and decided to stick my arm into it. It was so deep that you couldn't feel any kind of gravel or soil below. I guess Bob had just kept walking, so there I was with my hand in this hole below this concrete slab. I stood up and went to turn around to walk toward Bob. He was a ways off in the distance, but I could still see him. Before I could take a step, though, I felt like my body wasn't moving. It was as if someone had a huge hold on me. I couldn't move, and I couldn't speak. I was stuck. Bob finally notices me standing where he left me, and starts yelling for me to come on. But there was no moving for me, and I felt this grip just getting tighter and tighter. It felt like forever watching as Bob made his way back in my direction, going on about how he wanted to get home, how it was late. He was standing in front of me and looked at me like I'd completely lost it. He had been talking to me and asking me questions, and I, of course, could not move or make a sound. He reaches out to grab me to pull me along, and I didn't budge. As we stood there, he kept talking to me, seemingly thinking that I was messing with him, and he was laughing. Tears began to roll down my face. All I could think about was, how am I going to get this thing to let me go? Did I make it mad? I just kept apologizing in my head, saying how sorry I was for disturbing them, and that if they let me go that I would never bother them again. I'm assuming that they must have known that I was sorry for what I did. I drop to the gravel, and I quickly bolt up and take off running. I ended up leaving Bob behind. He came knocking on my door the next day to ask what happened. I had no idea how to even explain what I had experienced. All I know is that I have never bothered that grave again. I bought a replica of Ivan the Terrible and his son, an old piece of macabre art from Russia back in the day, and hung it up on my wall in a huge portrait behind me yesterday. It's a rumor or popular belief that the painting is cursed, and I've always been a fan of strange items and collectibles, so that's why I bought it. As I went to sleep last night, I was stricken with nightmares. Terrible nightmares. I dreamt I was in a camper with a friend and we sat down to watch a movie called Pendulum. It was a knockoff of Hellraiser. We began watching it and the computer screen just shut off, and we couldn't get it to turn back on, so we had a collective fuck it moment, and I exited the camper to go back inside to the house, whilst my dream friend stayed in the camper. As I came back out, still during the dream night, with a drink, I noticed blood splattered on the windows and rushed inside. My friend had been beaten to death, and Pendulum was pulling himself through the computer screen. After this, I woke up, and by that, I mean I came to a real-world setting where I was asleep on my couch last night. I attempted to get up and get some water, as I was thirsting after such a nightmare. I made it to the kitchen, cracked it open, and let it hit my lips. and then suddenly, I was on the couch again. In my mind at that moment, I considered that I had actually woken up. I sat up and walked into the kitchen again, cracked open that same water, when suddenly the refrigerator opened beside me, and I knew I was dreaming then. I woke up on the couch again, real as day, except it wasn't, as I went to drink that water again, and woke up on the couch again. After this is where it really started to get frightening. I considered that I was stuck in a loop, except this time I went to get up for water and walked past that area with the painting, and noticed that it was gone. This let me know I was still dreaming, and that I had another false awakening. I woke up for the water once more and started across the living room when I looked to an open doorway that I hang colorful beads from, and in the dark room veiled by the hanging threads was pendulum. That woke me again. This time I ran to the window and looked out to see cops rushing down my small street to the neighbor's house. My neighbor shot and killed her husband in the front yard 2 weeks ago, and that woke me up again. After waking up a few more times for water, I tried to go outside after another loop, except when I opened the front door, it was pitch black. Then car lights turned on and sped toward me. As I was about to get smacked with someone's F-150, I woke up again. At this point, I stopped trying to go anywhere and just kept trying over and over and over to slap myself truly awake. After looping for another 30 times or so, I eventually actually woke up and was relieved. I got that fucking water and downed it in one go. I live in Lompoc, California. I also live across the street from the cemetery. I used to hop the fence on one side of the cemetery to go to a friend's house who lived on the opposite side of it. If I went around, it would easily be a 4 to 5 block walk to her house. The keeper of the grounds who lived there called the cops on me several times, so I stopped. I also have been driving for years now, so there's no need anymore. Anyways, on one of my walks, I noticed a tree house in the cemetery off to the side. It was in a trench in a deep wooded area. There's been a few nights when I've gone and hung out inside of this treehouse with a few friends. However, every time I went, I would see spirits. I was scared many times, but seeing my friends happy and enjoying themselves was what made everything worth it. Except for one night in December of 2018 when I had brought new friends with me. During this time I was going through a lot and kind of hanging out with a bad group of people, some of whom were with me that night. Like I've mentioned, I always at least see something, but usually only for a few seconds. This time, though, I saw a rather large man, kind of burly yet completely transparent. I felt him before I actually saw him, how sad and lost he was. But I could also feel how gentle that his soul was, and that he was only looking for help or just someone to understand. Since I could feel him, I started hearing footsteps breaking twigs, leaves, and such. After the initial feeling, I started hearing footsteps breaking twigs, leaves, and such. My friends heard it too. I looked over, and I saw this man, and all I could feel was how confused that he was. He started to walk up, but froze once I saw him. I yelled out to him that it was okay and that we weren't going to hurt him. I told him that it was safe for him to be there if he wanted to stick around, but then my friends wanted to leave with how freaked out that they were. I walked out first to be his guide, and he walked in front of me until he disappeared seconds later. I don't think I really helped him, considering that I didn't have much chance being with that group of friends and all, but I could feel just how gentle that he was, like I said. Sometimes I feel that gentle presence whenever I visit the graveyard, and I think of him. Today I went, because today is also the anniversary of me losing a friend. I felt that gentle presence when I visited her grave today.
I actually laugh at this so much, but when it happens, I tend to just ignore it and be frightened. I'm agnostic, and I remember years ago that my friend used tarot cards for reading my future jobs. He said that I would work with kids, kindergarten, that I would work helping seniors, telecare, that I would work on a company that works with military fabrics, and at some point, at a church. When he said that, I laughed like, you have read it way wrongly, my buddy. Me, working at a church? I would burn before I put a single finger there. 2, maybe 3 years have passed, and I'm working not in a normal church, but in the 2 cathedrals of my city, which are famous all around my country. Everything was okay. My job partners are nice. I have a good salary, maybe some little paranormal behavior that we didn't really have to worry about. But due to COVID-19, one of the cathedrals has been closed temporarily. One of us goes there periodically to stay, watch, and wait for the vigilant guard. There are a lot of sounds, whispers, footsteps, light shapes, hard strikes around the place with no logic that scares me a lot. There are big doors that open and close. My boss told me that I had nothing to worry about because we were in a sacred place, so I tended to just ignore it. We also have a basement where the electrical installations are. We don't have to go down there, but sometimes we have. It has white and black tunnels. There are some rooms that were for wine barrels, but the whole of its interior space and the door looks like it was trapped in history. All of the little alcoves were also used for prisoners' cells, since at one point, the ruler of the Inquisition resided there. Everything always feels so heavy down there. The whispers are louder and more often. I always try to not think about it. I usually end up thinking that I'm just suggesting to myself that I'm hearing what I'm hearing, but after watch one day, on the cameras, oh my god. It wasn't really that scary to me, but talking about this to my friend and coworker that works as a guard, he showed me what the camera of the archive room was recording in that moment. Did you play Final Fantasy? If not, don't worry, just search how the souls look like on the game. There were a lot of almost the same kind of flames floating there in the empty and dark room. I was like, what the hell are those? Animas? Man, this isn't serious, bro. This must be a video trick or a filter. He responded with, those things don't hurt, but he suggested to me not to go into that room alone when the sun goes down, and if I have to, knock on the door and apologize for going inside. He said that they would disappear. Of course, he says that even if I go in, I wouldn't see them just through the camera, and that they don't always appear. The scariest thing was that one day I was in the bathroom and I heard someone come in and stand in front of my toilet door. I assumed it was the archivist because he likes that specific toilet, so I said, give me a minute and the toilet is yours, but I suggest you go for a walk. Haha. There was no reply, but someone took a breath very heavily, and a shadow was clearly under the door. George? I asked. Are you all right? Again, there was no reply, and the breath and shadow behind the door continued to stay there. Oh, I get it, Robert, always trying to prank me. How'd you get into the church? Oh, you came with the boss. I started to be scary because the reply was the same. I started to get really scared because the reply was the same, but there was someone clearly behind the door, deeply, heavily breathing. I just knew that whatever I wanted to do, like if he was a thief and I tried to call the police, he would break down the door easily, and down there in that bathroom, there was not really a signal anyway. If something was going to happen, the best thing was to record all of it on my phone. I asked again who was behind the door. No one replied. I took my keys and put them inside my fist, and after I opened the door, I found nobody. Needless to say, I never went back to those toilets. It sounds dumb, but the only thing I can think to do in those moments is to mock them or tell a joke. I can't say that it works, but it feels safe. And let's add that since then, everything in the place is on silent. I don't hear singing, I don't hear laughing, I don't hear whispers anymore.
I'm an atheist, not very superstitious, but my family are big believers and have always claimed that our house was haunted. So about 2 hours ago, I fell asleep in the guest bedroom. Everyone avoids that room, but I like the ambience, so I've been spending a lot of time in there lately. I should probably note that there's a mirror by the bed. So first, I thought my mom walked in, and I remember saying, "Get out!" I know I heard the door open. I just asked her if she went in, and she didn't even know that I was taking a nap. Then, as I was sleeping, I heard whispering and scratching sounds. I started remembering things that never happened, and I could envision a lady with black hair sitting on the couch in the room. I knew I needed to get the hell out of there, so I tried waking up. The dream was so vivid that I thought I did wake up. I looked around the room, and written in red everywhere was murder, death, etc. There were also red tally marks all over the walls. There was a doll on the floor. A life-sized cloth one. And that's when I knew I was still dreaming. Suddenly I look over to the couch, and there she is. It was the lady with black hair. I tried waking up, but at this point I was experiencing sleep paralysis and I couldn't open my eyes. Finally, I woke up for real and ran out of that room. I don't ever want to go back. Anyone have any ideas on what happened? Am I overreacting? Edit. Okay, I'm getting freaked out now. I just woke up, it's 5 a.m, to another dream. This time I was in a normal world and felt like I was being watched. I kept telling everyone, but they wouldn't believe me until I fell asleep in the dream. Something or someone pulled the blankets up and laid down next to me. I'm not joking. Someone please help. I don't know what's going on. I had a gut feeling that it was that thing again. I woke up and had to call my mom to come in. This is getting weird. For someone who doesn't believe in God, I want to call an exorcist. A few years ago, I was on holiday in the south of France with my boyfriend, now fiancé, and his family. We stayed in a small village about half an hour inland. One afternoon, me and my boyfriend went for a walk around the village and came across a church cemetery, so we went in to have a look. It wasn't creepy or anything, as it was just daytime, and it was right in the middle of the village, and there were a few cars going past and several people walking around. The cemetery was interesting to us because it was different to a British one, as there were little tombs the size of a garden shed around the edge that were very old and had whole families buried inside. After walking around for a while, we walked up to one of the tombs that had no glass on the door and looked inside. You couldn't see anything odd in there. There was a cross on the wall and a vase that would have had flowers in it. But the smell and the atmosphere changed right outside that tomb. It made us both feel ill, like a sudden sense of dread overtook everything. The air seemed stale. We left quite swiftly, and I felt as if we were being followed after that, until we left the cemetery and got back onto the pavement. This was probably the scariest thing to happen to me in real life. It took place a couple months ago while I was sightseeing the West Coast. I was visiting a small, quiet beach town in Oregon called Newport. It's basically situated on a cliff, and then down below is the beach. The beach itself is basically empty, and it is huge. It goes on for endless miles and seems like something out of a movie. I've never seen something so vast in my whole life. Anyway, I had spent most of the entire day on the beach, and when it got dark, I climbed back up the cliff to where my car was. I had originally planned to sleep on the beach in a tent, but it was starting to rain, so I figured I would just sleep in my car. I had been traveling all over Oregon and California for the last month, seeing national parks and stuff, and sleeping in my car most nights anyway. And this was literally the perfect, quiet little beach town, so I figured no big deal. I got to my car, which was parked in this public lot for beachgoers at the top of the cliff, but next to my car was the sign that said no overnight parking that I hadn't seen before, so I figured, dang, I guess I'll just go to another spot close by. So I looked on the maps on my phone and saw that 10 minutes away on the outside of town was a nature preserve. As I mentioned earlier, I had been staying at national parks and stuff, so I figured that it would be a nice place to sleep. The weather was beginning to get significantly worse, and I figured I should hurry. I drove there pretty fast, and by the time I did get there, it was completely dark and storming. I entered the nature preserve, which was a single road that followed the cliff line on the coast for a couple minutes with nothing but trees on one side and beach on the other. No cars, no houses, no buildings, no people for what seems like forever. As I drove down the road a little ways, I began to feel uneasy. It all seemed a little creepy, and I felt really alone, but the moon was shining bright through the clouds and the beach was visible, so I figured I was all right. I found a great peak spot on the cliff overlooking the beach and decided to back my car up on it and rest. I opened up the back of my Jeep and climbed in and went to sleep. After a few hours, I woke up. I wasn't sure what had caused me to wake up, but there I was, awake. By this time, the storm had turned into a full-blown monsoon. I could barely see out my windows. The rain was so thick, but I could hear the waves of the ocean down below crashing against the beach, and the wind was blowing so loud that my car was shaking. I noticed water was pouring in through the cracks of my Jeep, and I tried to reach for my phone so I could turn the light on, but I realized I left it in the front, which was blocked by all my luggage, and the only way to get there was to open up the back and step outside. I was about to open the latch and let myself out, and that was when I heard it. Laughter. It sounded like a child at first, playing, but soon I realized it had to be someone older. They had to be close to the car, too, because it was raining so hard there's no way I could hear it if it was far away. I figured it might be a cop telling me to move, but then again, it had to be like 3 or 4 in the morning, and why would they be all the way out here in this weather anyway? I froze to listen, and then I could tell that it was getting closer. I obviously wanted to look up to see, but the way my Jeep was parked was backing up to the end of the cliff facing the beach, and my luggage was literally stuffed all the way through the rest of the vehicle, blocking all side and front windows. I was crammed in the way back, so at the time I was literally trapped and could only see out the back window. It was at that moment that I realized how helpless I was. Her voice grew louder and louder. I could tell now that it was in no way a cop. She was laughing hysterically, the top of her lungs, screaming, "Ah ha 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 ha!" By the steady increasing of volume, I could tell she was definitely coming up to my car, and then between laughs, I heard her creepy voice say, "Oh, well, what are you doing all the way out here?" My heart dropped. Her voice sounded exactly like Bellatrix Lestrange from Harry Potter, and I immediately thought to myself, "Oh my God, I am going to die." I sat there, frozen solid. I didn't want to move. I remember thinking to myself, this is not happening, this is not happening, this is not happening. But it was. With the storm raging outside my car, my phone being nowhere in reach, me being trapped in the back of the Jeep with no easy exit, on the edge of a cliff in the middle of nowhere, with maniacal, laughing women getting closer and closer, I was literally living in a full-blown horror film. The only thing I could do was wait. I sat there for a few more moments, and then, that's when I saw her. I had poked my head up just a bit to see out the tiny space of visible window that looked to the side of my vehicle. About 10 feet or so from the Jeep, I could see through the thick rain and heavy fog a woman standing there facing not me, thank God, but the edge of the cliff toward the beach. Her arms were flaying up and down rapidly like a bird, and her head was twitching increasingly fast, all over in irregular patterns. Her clothes were ripped, and her voice was broken, and she literally looked like the zombies on The Walking Dead. I couldn't move. Literally all the fears built up in my head of what the source of this hysterical laughter may be came true in that second. I tried rationalizing the situation to myself like, she's on drugs, she's lost her mind, or this is someone joking, or literally anything. But every time I tried, I would peek back up and see that this is something inexplicable. It made no sense. How the hell would someone be out here in what I'm pretty sure was a Category 5 monsoon, 5 miles away from anything, no car, freezing temperature, standing up, screaming in the dead of night? I just couldn't believe it. She kept laughing hysterically, shaking her body all over as if she were fully possessed. I couldn't understand what words she was shouting in between laughs, but it sounded demonic. I was mortified. By the grace of God, I ended up finding a significantly large hunting knife stowed away in the bag next to me in the back of the Jeep, and after taking one last good look at this bewildered, wild devil witch woman, I decided it was time to say a prayer and try my best to sleep. I honestly don't know how I managed to do that, because if I remember right, she probably stayed there for another 30 minutes, howling at the moon. But somehow I did. And the next morning when I woke up, I slowly stepped out of my Jeep, knife in hand, of course, and I looked around. And there was nobody there. It was as if it had never happened. The sun was shining now, and the beach was calm. It was just me, and me alone.
My dad was a pastor at a church for 4 years. Many people had died in this church before we got there. Over the course of these 4 years, some of the craziest, inexplicable stuff happened. I'm here to tell you a few of the best stories. My parents went to Maine every year. I had gotten tired of the trip and decided to stay home. I went over to the church to grab some snacks from the back of the old sanctuary. There were 2 sanctuaries. One was about 90 years old, and the newer one was about 50 years old. Anyways, I went to the back where the snack booth was. Mind you, this was the middle of the day, so it was completely lit up through the stained glass windows. I bent down to grab some drinks from the mini fridge under the counter. When I stood back up and turned to walk out, I saw this figure standing in the doorway. It had no nose, mouth, eyes, or ears. It was just a bald head wearing a long, dark robe. The moment I laid eyes on it, it vanished. It's safe to say I ran out of there as fast as humanly possible. Another time, my cousin came over to spend the night at my house. We wanted to play PS4, but the other controller was over at the church. So we walked over there through my yard. It was pitch black out. When we opened the door, we might have made it 2 or 3 feet in before we heard the loudest, spine-tingling scream that I have ever heard coming from the back of the new sanctuary. We ran back outside and back into my house so fast. My cousin was on the verge of crying and kept saying that he was never going back into that church again. The church had a preschool in it. They would change out the toys in the classes every now and then so that the kids wouldn't get bored of them. One time the teacher took one of the kids upstairs to help her pick out some toys for the rest of the class. The old classrooms upstairs were used for storing said toys, extra chairs, and old desks at the time, so there was no one else up there except for the 2 of them. As the teacher was grabbing the toys, the kid that she had brought to help said, "Hey, look at those kids playing with the toys over there." These are just a few of the experiences that people have had. I could sit and write out hundreds of paranormal experiences linked to that church, however, if I had the time. My father is a policeman. He's a no-nonsense guy who lives very much in the here and now and believes only in what he can see and feel or hear for himself. At the time of this story, he was in the police force for more than 20 years and I was a teenager. My father worked night shifts, and on a regular basis he would come home early in the morning to have breakfast with us. He would then go to bed, and we would go to school. He was usually in a good mood and would tell us funny or interesting stories from his day or night at work. At this particular morning, he was unusually silent, and he didn't eat either. My mother asked if he felt all right. It took him a while to actually answer, and he said, "I'm not sure what I experienced tonight." He didn't want to say any more in front of us kids, but we prodded him long enough until he told us the following. It had been a quiet night, and he was out with his colleague in a police car. At some point they were informed over the radio that a car chase was going on not far from them, and their assistance was required. They drove off toward the chase, and soon caught up with the suspect's vehicle. The radio had informed them that 2 men were in the front seat of the car. My father's car pulled up almost beside the car so that he managed to get a good look at the inside. He saw the 2 men in the front arguing heatedly with each other, and then he saw another man in the back. He had no hair and was so pale that he almost seemed white. He was dressed in all black. He looked directly at my father, his face almost pressed against the window with very dark eyes, and he grinned widely. My father was deeply unsettled by this person. He seemed to look directly into my father's eyes. My father was so sure of this third person that he informed the other police cars about him. The chase ended with the car crashing into a fence and the suspects fleeing into a field. They were apprehended only minutes later. There were 2 men, not 3. My father asked his colleagues at the scene if they were sure that there hadn't been a third guy. No one else had seen him. "I can't explain it," he said to us. "I saw him clear as day, and he grinned at me like death himself." This took place in 2004-2005 in Germany. To this day, we have no logical explanation for what he really saw and experienced.
This happened about 13 years ago. I'm currently 28 and my childhood dog died in early high school for me. This wasn't too long after. Upon looking up what this is, it was most likely a false awakening, but still gives me chills to this day. I shared a room with my older brother, who was a pretty heavy sleeper once he got there. He'd usually be up playing video games all night, and I got used to being able to fall asleep through the sounds of him yelling at COD players for using noob tubes and all that good stuff. One night I woke up feeling the foot of my bed sink in like someone was down there. When I looked, I noticed a small child sitting with his back toward me. The child seemed to be wearing a black shirt with white horizontal stripes. I immediately thought to myself, all right, fuck that, and went back to sleep. I woke up what felt like a few hours later, and he was now standing at the foot of my bed, facing me, holding my dead dog's head in his hands. The child was surrounded by an extremely dark aura, so much so that I didn't gather any details on skin complexion or anything. I immediately lost my shit and freaked out, falling out of my bed. This part creeped me out because the fall was very detailed. I knocked over an acoustic guitar that I had on a stand near my bed when I fell out, and my brother shuffled in his sleep due to the noise. When I tried to wake him up, he mumbled, half asleep, that we needed to get more Pepsi, not an encounter with him that would surprise me at all, and went back to sleep. I then scrambled back into my bed, all while this kid was just watching me, holding my dog's head throughout. I fell back asleep, and then had my real awakening that morning. The guitar was in its stand, and everything was normal. I ended up not telling anybody about this dream. The really fucked up part, and why this particularly bad dream still gives me chills, has to do with the fact that my dog was buried in my backyard, in a little side yard that always had some really weird energy to it. Months later, my friends and I were hanging out, and we usually smoke weed in my backyard close to this side yard area. We had made our way inside and were munching and watching movies when my good friend Joe said that he needed to run to the backyard and get his phone. He went out to get it with his usual demeanor, but I heard his footsteps running full sprint back to the back door into the house. His skin was pale, and he was visibly shaken up. I asked him what was wrong. His response? Dude, you're going to think I'm crazy, but I just saw a little kid standing where your dog is buried. I took my young kids to visit my grandparents' gravesite for the first time. They were really freaked out to learn that dead people were buried underneath all the headstones. The headstone kitty-cornered to my grandparents was for a small boy around 4 or 5. When I noticed the age, I heard a whisper in my ear to talk about the kid. As I said, my kiddos were already really freaked out. I didn't want to add to the experience of learning about dead kids. I heard the whisper 2 or 3 times before we left. When we got into the car, my son said, "Who was that boy standing next to Grandpa? He looked really sick." I instantly had chills and got super emotional knowing that my grandpa was there with him. This is my one and only paranormal or unexplained experience. I was never exactly a believer, but I'd never completely disregarded the existence of the otherworldly. It happened a few years ago, sometime in the winter of 2016. I randomly woke up in the middle of the night, and the first thing that I noticed was how dark that my room was. It was supposed to be dark, as I had all my lights off and the windows closed, but you know, a little bit of tiny light from the outside street light always finds a way to enter from the edges of closed windows, like you can barely distinguish the pitch black from a slight aura, right? But there was none of it. It was pitch black all around. I thought it was probably a power outage, and I started to think random stuff like, probably this is what blind people see all their life. Must be sad. And slowly drifting back into sleep, when I was suddenly reawoken by the feeling of my bed shaking. I thought I had fallen asleep, and this is one of those sleep jerks that happen when you fall into your dream. But then more stuff started to happen. Soon after the first shake, there was a second one, which I felt much more clearly.
A big rat had been invading our kitchen for a while, and I thought maybe it had somehow snuck into my room. But how could a rat shake my bed? Then, a few seconds later, I felt a literal punch under my bed, as if someone had punched the underside of my mattress right beneath where I was laying. I felt the mattress bump up in the center of my back. Oddly enough, instead of freaking out, I became extremely calm. And oddly enough again, I started to think of a logical reason. My mom made me check under my bed before sleeping, as she thought that some thief might have snuck into our home. She overthinks a lot. I thought that maybe someone actually had snuck in this time, but why would he disturb me instead of... And I felt another 2 consecutive punches from under me, right as I was having that thought. I froze for a solid minute, finally realizing that things might be abnormal here. Maybe I'm bragging, but after freezing initially, I went weirdly calm again, almost as if my brain went, oh no, it's a ghost. Anyway, there was a final punch, followed again by the bed shaking. I remember as the bed was shaking, I got up almost subconsciously, walked straight to the light switch on the other side of the room, and turned the lights on. There was nothing out of the ordinary. I looked under my bed with a flashlight. Also nothing. I should have freaked out here, but I didn't, which is really odd for someone like me who gets nervous and shaky for even the simplest social situations. My body worked almost on its own. I turned the lights off, took the flashlight with me to bed, and fell asleep as soon as I hit the mattress. And then it was morning. Nothing ever happened after that.
I want to start by saying that I'm no stranger to odd dreams. I have experienced sleep paralysis many a time throughout my life. I had a dream shadow stalker for years, and I used to have a haunted bed frame that gave me some of the worst night terrors I've ever had. I have shaman blood on my dad's side, and I myself have been studying various aspects of the occult and paranormal for over a decade. But those stories are for another post. I'm just used to this sort of thing. I wanted to express that. That leads me here. Not sure if anyone's felt this as well, but I have been a ball of anxiety lately. Obviously related to the uncertainty in the world and all, yet I still shouldn't feel it this much. The dreams I've been experiencing have been extremely strange. Like I said, I have vivid, lifelike dreams constantly, but typically they're broken up. I have been having Inception-style dreams for the past 2 months every time I go to sleep. Like I'll dream of actually waking up and going about my day, but then I actually wake up. It's so disorientating. Last night, I had a very weird dream. The strangest of them all. I can't recall what I was doing, but I remember distinctly being in a dark, dusty room. The only part I truly know is that there was some kind of box or container with a lid in front of me. Everything was in first person. It felt so real. I lifted the box, and laying in it were 2 dead gray mice. They were stiff and curled towards each other, like a heart almost. That's all I can remember. I only remembered specifically because my significant other said something about a mouse this morning. I did some investigation and read that this could mean a period of financial instability, but was curious to see if anyone else had any ideas.
My birthday was on April 14th, and I had just turned 12, so there were multiple balloons on the floor where this happened. It was around 3:30 a.m. on Sunday, and my family was asleep, but I was playing with my new birthday present, a Nintendo Switch, in my bedroom. I heard a loud pop sound coming from the kitchen, It sounded like a balloon, but louder and sort of more aggressive, if that makes sense. I put down my Nintendo Switch and tell the girl that I was playing with that I would be right back. I opened my bedroom door and headed to the living room to explore the cause of this noise. I saw a deflated balloon in the same spot where it was earlier. Out of the corner of my eye, I see a misty white apparition in the shape of a woman, maybe about 4 feet tall, seated on my dad's sheepskin chair. I felt extremely cold, and an inexplicable feeling washed over me. The best way I can describe it is an overwhelming feeling of dread. I really wanted to go back to the safety of my own room, so I turned around and went back inside. I was playing with my friend and it was around 4:15 a.m. when I heard another noise coming from the living room. It was the sort of sound that you hear when something falls on glass but doesn't break it. Being scared as hell, I decided not to explore as the sun was rising and I was getting ready for online school, and I go to the living room and the second noise happened. I see a framed picture lying face down on the ground. The picture is of my grandma who died in 2009, holding me as a baby.
I was riding my bike down a long road with almost zero vehicles on it. I was in the dedicated bike lane, scooting along as I'd done hundreds of times before down this stretch of road. There's about 3 feet of opening gap between the curb of this road and the bike lane, followed by a 3-foot wide bike lane, and then finally the vehicle lane. Vehicles are not allowed to park in the gap or bike lane unless they're the city maintenance vehicle crews. Vehicles are not allowed to park in the gap or the bike lane unless they're the city maintenance crews that service the road, grass, and noise walls of this particular stretch. Well, this day there was a big blue moving truck parked right on the curb, wide enough to take up the empty 3-foot gap and the 3-foot wide bike lane and spill over into the vehicle lane. I thought, no big deal, as there weren't any cars behind me and I had plenty of space to move into the road to go around it. The spot where the truck was stopped was the only spot on the stretch of road where the shrubbery from the other side of the noise wall was growing into the ground and out the other side. It sticks out like a sore thumb. But anyway, as I was going around the truck and into the vehicle lane, the door to the cab of the truck flew open forcefully right as I was about to pass it. I'm talking like the person that threw it open was trying their best to hurt me and waited for the best opportunity. At the last second, I clenched my teeth, swerved out of the way, and just instinctively swerved back into the bike lane and came to a stop. Angry and full of adrenaline, I screamed at them what was their problem, that they could have killed me, while dismounting my bike and making my way to the truck. This is where it got strange. There was no one inside the truck itself. I went back toward it, and there was no one outside of the truck either. It was really just there, with the door still wide open. There was nowhere anyone could have slipped away to. The noise walls are there to spare the neighboring homes from car noises, and they're about 10 feet tall, and they stretch out for a good quarter mile, with no open gaps anywhere. I went around to the back of the truck, and it was open and empty. Nothing in it, no hiding spots. Just an empty truck and an empty cab. I decided to just jump on my bike and go home. I pushed it out of my head and considered myself lucky to be unharmed. That lasted about a day. I can't help but feel like I was in some moment in time that somehow got stuck. Upon remembering the occurrence, there was almost no sound. No other cars driving by, no birds chirping, no wind blowing on what was actually a fairly windy day. It wasn't until I got closer to my home that everything felt normal again, and I was able to move past it. Now it plagues me that I didn't take a photo with my phone or didn't look for one of those "How's my driving" stickers to report the truck. It's one of those glitches that I'm just gonna have to wonder about forever.
I lost my dad a couple of years ago to ALS. It was a rough way to go. We were very close. I'm an only child and a daddy's girl. We always promised each other, whoever went first, that we would try to reach out from the other side. There have been many ways that he's been in touch. Some have been more subtle, like giving me the strong urge to hear a song that's not my usual genre, country, but while I was deeply grieving, I suddenly had to hear Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain. I always thought that was just a breakup song, but when I played it on Spotify and listened to it, much different. The lyrics are about losing someone, but that we'll be walking hand in hand again in the land that knows no parting. In the afterlife, in other words. I knew as I heard it that it was a direct message. Also, he came to me in a dream. You know the difference between if it's just a vision or a dream, and this was the only actual visit. For about a year after he died, the standing lamp in my living room would come on its own every now and then. I would just say, "Hi, Dad." One night while I was taking the dog out before bed, it was a full moon in February of 2020 about midnight, I witnessed a small rock being kicked toward me out in the street in front of my house. There was no wind that night, and even if there were, wind doesn't blow rocks, much less uphill. He always rather liked to kick rocks if he passed them as we walked the dog, so it seems like a dad way to reach out. So I said, "Hi, Dad." I kept the rock. But the most recent things left me with some very sweet keepsakes. First, he left an orange heart in my robe pocket. I don't wear my robe outside the house anywhere. I have no idea how it got there, just a little paper cutout of a heart. Orange was his favorite color. He loved bright colors. I said, "I love you too, Daddy." I taped it to my bathroom mirror to remind me that he is still okay and that he still loves me. Then, about a month later, my hubby and I were cuddling one weekend morning, and we heard a loud bang from the garage downstairs. We didn't realize what it was until later in the day. I saw the back door had been slammed open somehow, and had been open all day long. I closed the door and mused about how odd that it was that it had opened with such force when it hadn't been windy, and that there were no vibrations or anything. The next day I go to do laundry. The machine is in the garage, and at my feet in front of the washing machine is a yellow felt heart with sheet music cut out in a heart shape glued to the front of it. My dad was a pianist, and music was everything to him. It was a little dirty. I can't imagine where he got it from, or what it had to blow through to get to my garage door. I think he opened the door the day before so that he could get that heart in there somehow. It was just above and beyond. I don't know how hard it is to do that kind of thing from the other side, but I just feel so very loved that he went to the trouble and found a way somehow. I taped that one to my mirror as well. Lastly, on my parents' anniversary this January, Mom woke up to a light on in the living room. It was the light on the wall that used to hang above Dad's recliner, an old-fashioned looking one with 2 separate bulbs. He loved that light. He had it on a little remote plug and everything. When he got ALS, I put it on a smart plug so that he could tell Alexa to turn it on for him, until talking became too difficult anyway. But it stopped working with Alexa right after he died, so Mom hasn't turned it on herself since then because she has back pain and can't be bending over to rotate the little switch that's on the cord. After a couple years off, suddenly it was on their anniversary. She left it on all day. After an entire year alone, mostly because of COVID, I think she especially needed that sign that he was still with her. It was the first physical sign that she's ever gotten from him, and it's proof that love never really dies. This happened around 2006 or 7. There is this guy. I'll call him Dean here, who's widely known in my small village. Dean was a drug addict, but managed somehow to work and build a family. But his addiction got worse, and eventually I got the news that he died in a mixed drugs overdose. We, friends and my then boyfriend, talked on a few different occasions about his death. how it was somehow foreseeable that he would die, and so on.
Not long after he passed, like 2 months, I had just opened our pub at 4 p.m. and Dean walks in. He didn't look great, but he also didn't look dead. He noticed my facial expression and got slightly pissed as to why I was looking at him in such a way, so I quickly shook it off and served him. Later that evening, when my boyfriend arrived, I asked him what was going on with Dean, that he should be 6 feet under. But he said that he had no knowledge about Dean being dead, or that we had had talks about it. I asked them if maybe I confused him with someone else's death who we all knew and we were talking about, but they denied having knowledge of someone else's death. Funny part is that after this happened, Dean got rid of his addiction and got his shit together. A glitch which happened earlier, around 2004, where my same as above boyfriend and best friend and I went to Berlin for 3 days. We rented a room for 3 in a little lo-fi hotel. So the first evening, it was Friday, we went out and looked for a location to have a good time. Locals guided us to a known party street where usually a lot of people were out. But for some unknown reason, nothing was going on that night at all. Only a few people were there. We still decided to bar hop and have a good time, just us 3. We drank a lot of tequila and water, and after we got kicked out of a bar, only for the reason that the owner disliked our nationality, we left this street and walked up to a kebab where we ate and drank even more, and then decided to head towards our hotel. We did, and the next thing I clearly remember was that we entered a really tiny, cozy bar which was plastered in red velvet and had all dimmed down lights. I think even the carpeting was velvet. We had funny talks with the older locals, men and women, inside, and they were thrilled about our language when we talked to each other. At one point, I felt too drunk and said to my companions that I wanted to go to bed. They felt the same, and we left. I then literally stormed away along this street, thinking our hotel was about 1 kilometer or so away, and I wanted to hurry. But after I went like this for about 20 meters, my companions yelled after me so that I would come back, because our hotel seemed to be right next door to that bar. Really, really next. Like next in the way of the bar door and the hotel door were about 20 centimeters away from each other. We didn't notice the bar when we arrived, and when we left the hotel earlier that day. Well confused, we went in and slept. The next day at noon, when we went out, there was no bar at all next to our hotel. Not even its door. And it didn't show up the following night either. We are still talking about this, and at least this time my friend and former boyfriend seem to remember the same things. A few years back, my friends and I were at our church late at night playing D&D. Our friend Brenton was the son of the pastor. His name was Robin, and he was not only our pastor, but a licensed exorcist as well. It was 5 of us kids there. Brenton, Scott, Zach, Quashawn, me, and also Brenton's dad was in the building. My mom showed up later after D&D, making for a total of 7 people in the church. So us kids were tasked with turning the lights off all throughout the building. We ran around getting it done and decided to meet up in the chapel upstairs. That chapel is tiny, with only 4 pews on each side meant for younger kids. When the last light for the chapel where we had met up in was turned off, the atmosphere did a complete 180. Things felt different to me at least, but to my friends not so much. They laughed, joked, and focused on scaring my mom. We sat in the chapel room for a bit waiting, asking the typical, "If anyone is here, please reveal yourselves," requests. Of course, there was nothing. It made me a little upset, as my mom and I love the paranormal, and to not get anything right off the bat was disappointing. Robin, Brenton's dad, suggested that we go next door to the nursery's kid playroom. We agreed and made the 10-second trek. My mom didn't like it. She had been taking photos before with the flash on, hoping to catch something, but was refusing to do so at that point. She said she was afraid of seeing something. When we asked for a sign from anyone who might be present, the smell of vanilla perfume filled the room. You're probably thinking that it was just my mom's perfume, and I don't blame you. But no, she can't use perfume as she gets sick when she smells it. I asked Robin what it could be, and he told me that back in the 50s, there had been an employee who worked in the nursery. She had worn vanilla perfume to work every day, and older people who had known her could confirm that. We decided to walk down to the main chapel, which was huge, by the way. We sat in the middle row of the first 2 pews. Kids sat in the second. The 2 adults in the first. All of us kids started feeling sick, like we were about to puke. Brenton's dad noticed this and suggested that we go to the basement for one last try, and that after that we should call it a night. We all thought, why not, and decided to go. We sat in the basement on the couch facing toward the wall, which was a good distance away since the whole basement was actually a dining hall with a kitchen next to it. Next to me on the couch was my mom, Zach, Quishan, and Robin. Brenton was actually still sick and laid out on the sofa chair in front of us, while Scott laid on the floor playing with his phone. Quishan started snapping photos non-stop. I swear he took over 100 in the basement alone. With every photo taken, there was a red haze that seemed to grow brighter and brighter. Then we heard clicking. It sounded like a light switch coming from the storage room. We were all like, I'm not checking that out. Send Scott. He shrugged and went to go check. Sometimes I think he wants to die, but really he just doesn't care about anything remotely scary. He walked up and discovered that the storage room light was turning on and off by itself. He called back to tell us that he thought someone might be in the room. Robin stood up and told him to open the door. Scott did as he was directed, and sure enough, the light was on, but no one was in there. Scott closed the door and walked back, laid on the ground, and got back on his phone like nothing strange was going on. Quishan was back at it again snapping photos, until one of the images made him pause entirely and say, hey Robin, can you look at this? Robin grabbed the phone, chuckled, and said, Yup, that's something all right. My mom asked to see it as well, and then emitted the loudest scream ever before running behind the couch. I asked to look at it, telling her that she had to be overreacting. She yelled at me and for the first time in my life told me to shut up. I looked at the photograph, and right in the middle of the basement, clear as day, was a person standing there. He was old and bald, with a Catholic robe on and a red sash, arms by his side. I couldn't make out anything below his knees. I saw facial features and everything else, though. I looked up, terrified, fear of what I saw rushing through my body. I screamed, jumped up, and ran toward the corner. Robin rushed and turned the lights on, making my mom feel safer. We called it quits and went upstairs. We found old photos of the priest in the church's photo albums. Robin asked me to point out the man that I had seen, and I did. It was the exact man from the basement photo, but instead a much older photo of him when he had been alive. Robin agreed that he did indeed look the same, and so did Quishan, along with my mom. We packed up the D&D game, put everything into the car, and we all drove home. Sadly, we tried to recover the photos and transfer them to a computer, but all of the files showed up as being corrupted. After this experience, nothing else has happened, at least aside from one instance. Our friend's dad was leaving the church, so we did one last game night with no ghost hunt, where we played D&D for 6 hours straight. This was only a year ago. We were packing up the car. Everyone was outside talking. I walked to the front of the church, just reminiscing about all the good times that we had there, and how it felt like a chapter of our childhood was coming to an end. That's when I saw a black figure in the bell tower. I stared at it and knew that it was staring back at me. I looked at it one last time and walked back to the car without telling anyone. We miss that church every day.
I stopped going after Robin left. One day I was sent to clean up the nursery with no help. The whole time I was in there alone, I felt as though I were being watched, and didn't feel safe. I ran out for the last time when I heard a little kid giggling in the playroom.
Since I was 18 or so, I've been having dreams where I know it's a dream, but I cannot wake up. Once, I dreamed that I was sleeping in my bed at my parents' house, and suddenly I woke up in the dream, and everything was normal. TV on, door slightly open, but there was a weird feeling in the room, which I ignored. I tried to get back to sleep, but my conscience told me to turn my head to the door, which I did. It was slightly open again, but this time it was opening a little more every second that passed, and a dark presence was on the other side of the room. At this point, I freaked out, jumped out of my bed, and tried to get out of the room, but something was holding me back, and the path from my bed to the door seemed eternal. Suddenly, everything stopped, and I woke up again in the same position I dreamed of first, TV on, door slightly open. I was still dreaming, and the same thing happened again. Door slowly opening, and me trying to run away from the room through a never-ending path from my bed to the door, with a weird feeling of someone watching me all along. This was a cycle that happened a number of times, that I can't remember, but it was more than 4. I knew I was dreaming, but could not wake up. I was really scared. I tried to wake me up by yelling or hitting me in the dream. Nothing worked. I remember that in real life I was not in my parents' house, and therefore I was not in that bed. At that moment, when I remembered that, I woke up. I dreamed something like that a couple of weeks ago where I couldn't wake up even though I knew I was dreaming. I have no idea why this happens. This was a pretty surreal experience for me, and the few people that I've told agreed that perhaps someone was watching over me and warning me. A couple of years ago, I lived in a place close to the sea. At night, I used to take my dog down through the town center to the seafront for a nice walk. I eventually discovered that there was a small graveyard with gates on either side which I could cut through. I kind of like walking through graveyards, especially at night, because it is creepy in a very cool kind of way. I did this quite a lot, and never once felt afraid. However, one night I was walking up to the gates, and I felt the strongest feeling of dread. No reason for it. Nothing was different. But it was like something was screaming at me to not go through. Do not walk through the graveyard tonight. I didn't. I turned around and went the other way. It was such a bizarre sensation, given that before I had walked there plenty of times without meeting anyone, with nothing happening. I genuinely believe that if I had ignored that and walked on through, something would have happened. Who knows what, or what was lurking there that night. I never went that way again. Some people have told me that I had a guardian angel who was warning me of the danger. This story took place when I was a kid. My dad has been a pool man for many years. One of his oldest customers decided to purchase a ranch. I don't exactly remember where. He asked my dad if he could come and fix their pool, which was disastrously maintained before he bought it. He gave my dad permission to bring us along, and told us we were welcome to stay a few days to enjoy the ranch. We drove there, and I had been in charge of reading the MapQuest instructions because I never seemed to be able to sleep during car trips.
We drove back home a few days later after my dad was finally able to save the pool. The drive home was very long. For whole stretches, the view was mostly desert, farms, and the occasional suburban town. Unlike me, my mom and brothers knocked out almost immediately. So most of the trip, it was just my dad and I talking or listening to music. I'm also a very avid reader, so I had a book on my lap beside the maps. I remember the ride had been quiet for a while because I had been reading. I had to stop because it was getting dark, and my dad only let me turn on the dome lights to read the maps. No radio service, and the Game Boy's batteries had all died. All I had left to do was look outside. All of a sudden, I spotted a very tall shadow on a roof. I recognized that there was a man who seemed to be wearing a hat, bowler or top hat, dancing and jumping from roof to roof of this suburban lot. It was kind of like the scene from Singing in the Rain, which at that point I had not seen yet. It took a second to realize that it wasn't a normal thing to just happen. The houses were separated in a way where a normal person couldn't possibly have jumped roof to roof. What scared me the most is how at the last house before a field he seemed to turn around and sense me. He bowed and tipped his hat. Even though I couldn't see it, I could sense him smiling. All I felt was dread. I turned to face my dad to see if he had seen him as well, but he had been paying attention to the road. When I turned back, I couldn't see the houses anymore. They were way behind us. I never saw a face or any details. He was just a silhouette on the roofs. I remember feeling afraid that he might follow us, or that he could if he wanted to. I never saw something like that on our many road trips ever again. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it, but it felt so real. The memory is very vivid as well, which always comes back when I'm watching old musicals because the dancing reminds me of the way that he moved. This happened today at a church that I took my grandma to. I haven't been since I was a kid, and figured it might be nice to go again. At first, the church seemed very homey. I come from a small town in Kentucky, but live in a city now, so I really enjoyed the change of pace. A lot of people at the church also used to live in Kentucky and still have family there, which made it feel as if there were a small piece of home right there with me. The service was short and simple. They started out with praise and worship, followed by prayer. After the prayer, they opened the side door and invited God, the Holy Spirit, and His angels into the church. Then they had an evangelist come in and preach a sermon. I was getting weird vibes at this point for whatever reason. I figured it was because I hadn't been to church in so long, and it had to do with a few personal reasons from my last church experiences. I was sort of zoning out while the evangelist had the stage. He got really into his sermon. He was yelling and putting his arm out toward us. Mid-screaming/preaching, his microphone messed up, and it made him sound demonic and loud. I know technical issues like that can happen, so I didn't think anything of it. He changes his microphone and carries on. While he's going on again, there's knocking at the side door, and all of a sudden it just flies open. I initially chalked it up to the wind, but the lights began to flicker as he continued talking. Everyone kept praising God and saying that the Spirit was in the church. They really seemed to enjoy these things that were happening. After the service was over, the preacher's wife went up to the podium and said that while all the weird stuff was happening, that she could hear everything upstairs. She also said that while she was up there, that she saw things running past out of the corner of her eye, and that a door had been slammed in her face. Not quite sure what to think of all this. I've never experienced anything in a public place like that, and definitely never expected to in a church. Like I said, everyone was really into it, and said that it was God or angels. I'm an open and spiritual person and have experienced a lot of paranormal, but I didn't feel that whatever that was a good thing. I felt bad vibes before things started happening. Vibes that I continued to feel up until we left there.
I haven't posted this here before, but I have commented about this incident in other posts. But having recently found this subreddit, I think it definitely fits in here. It was a couple of years ago. I was visiting my parents who still live in the same house that I grew up in. The day I came home, Mum told me that my old school bus driver had passed away the day before. I'd been very fond of him and would often bump into him before I had moved out of that town, as he lived in the same neighborhood as ours. So when Mum told me about his passing away, it was a heart attack, she said, I was quite upset, and I distinctly remember every detail about the conversation that I had with my mum about this. Later that evening, when I was out on a run, I noticed a little blue flyer by the park with his photograph and details of the funeral and a prayer meeting. A couple of days later, I was out buying groceries from the market, when I saw him standing outside a shop, looking very much alive. I was confused AF, and wondered if he had a twin brother. Either way, I didn't stop to chat. Later at home, when I told my mom what happened, she looked really confused and said that she never told me that he had died. I was naturally annoyed and tried to help her recall the conversation and told her about the flyer at the park. She asked me if I was okay, 'cause she was sure as hell that she did not say any such thing about his death. So I go out to walk by the park to see if the flyer is still there, and it wasn't. I was extremely confused by this point, but having no logical explanation to offer, I decided to dismiss it. Not for long, though. A few days later, my holiday had come to an end, and I had returned back to the city where I work. Exactly a day later, I get a call from my mom saying that my bus driver had passed away that morning, and that it had been a heart attack. I couldn't believe it, and I figured that my mom was a bit freaked out too, 'cause she sounded a bit shaky. Not knowing what else to say, I asked her to check if a blue flyer with details of his funeral and prayer meetings was up at the park, whenever she could step out for a walk. Later that evening, she confirmed that there was a blue flyer with those details and his picture. Mom dismissed it as a coincidence and has never spoken of this incident again. Whenever I have tried to remind her, she says she doesn't recall all the details. But I know it's not true, and that she does remember this. It's just so freaky, and I get the chills every time I think about it. I just haven't been able to explain what happened.
I'm living in an older century 3-story house in a small town in Ontario. I was laying on the first set of stairs beside the front door next to my dog, I think taking his leash off for a walk. He's a big boxer shepherd full of love. Anyways, I hear this very loud and unusual sound, like something has come loose or broken. I'm home alone. I actually thought maybe it had come from the basement because I was so close by there. But then I realized that it was not, because the sound had gotten further away. I went up to the 3rd floor, which is actually like a split level with 2 empty rooms. Both remain empty since we've lived here, my wife and I. I go upstairs, not sure what I was expecting, but generally am a very logical human being. We have old bedroom doors with skeleton key handles, and when I get upstairs, I see that one handle is literally shaking up and down, almost vibrating. It didn't just go on for a couple of seconds. Remember, it carried on from when I went to check the basement and went upstairs, and now, as I was staring at it, it continued to vibrate. I grabbed the handle to make it stop, which it did completely. I opened the door to see nothing there and nothing in the room across either. We keep both doors closed, and the windows closed, and also the vents closed because we don't want heat or cool coming up to a floor that we don't even use. To this day, I have not figured out what caused this, and it hasn't happened since. Note, I don't remember any behavior from my dog. He may have been a bit timid, but he gets like this whenever my mood shifts to anxiety. There's one other experience that I had in our home. Our dining room is attached to the garage, and it is not a proper exterior door. It's another old, beautiful wooden door with a skeleton key and all. One day as I was cleaning, I shut the door just enough so that it was closed but not fully sealed, which I do this all the time. I went to my bedroom and heard the door to the garage swing open. Again, no other surrounding windows were open that could have made the air shift. Nothing was different than any other day when I do this. One other side note, my dog is terrified of our rocking chair. It's an old one that I had spray painted black. Never thought anything of it because honestly this dog is kind of scared of everything. He doesn't like certain flooring, which I'm assuming is because he must have had a bad fall at our old house or something, because even if I put a big piece of meat treat for him across a tiled floor, he won't enter. And yes, we trim his claws, so I'm thinking it's a bit of trauma or a phobia. He's a big baby, so it's probably nothing but just another weird thing to the house. Any ideas on the shaking handle, though? It was aggressive, and even if something was in an empty room, something, say, fell on it, causing it to shake, why wouldn't it stop?
I travel to many different cemeteries for work in Massachusetts. I'm a grave salesperson and go to these cemeteries on an as-needed basis. One day I was finishing up a sale and decided to use the bathroom in the tiny office shed in the back of the cemetery. The door to enter the office was locked, but the bathroom door was broken and wouldn't close all the way. I didn't care that the bathroom door wouldn't really close because no one was coming into the office anyway. It was late, and all the groundsmen had went home for the day. Just as I was finishing my business, the bathroom door slams shut, and since the knob was broken, the door just bounced and swung open. My first reaction was that someone had entered the office and the air pressure had sucked the door open. I run out and see that no one had come in. There were no open windows to cause a breeze. This door just slammed and opened all on its own. I was shaken up, but I still had some paperwork to complete. I acknowledged that there may be a presence in the room with me, but I didn't want to appear frightened of it. So I sat down in there for a few minutes and took my time finishing my work. Nothing has happened there since then, but I always acknowledge the entity as if it's watching over the place. This happened about 15 years ago. I woke up that day feeling really odd, and my very good friend back then called me and said that she woke up also feeling weird, so I told her to come over. We couldn't shake this strange feeling off. Something just felt weird, but we couldn't put a finger on it. We decided to go out in the evening, and when we were walking through Piccadilly Circus in London, something crazy happened. The closest thing that I could compare it to would be that we ended up in this see-through bubble, and everything around us paused for about 3 seconds, and we were, me and her, in sort of slow motion while we were in that bubble. And then snap, and everything went back to normal, but we stood there looking at each other completely and utterly freaked out, as we both experienced the same thing. We just stood there in shock, thinking, what the fuck just happened? We were so shaken by this that we had one drink in the bar and decided to go home. She went to mine as she didn't want to be alone, so we took the train back, and while we were walking to my house, we heard a gunshot. And that bullet passed me by an inch and went into a car that was parked next to us on the side of the road. I literally felt it touch my hair while flying past me. There was a guy in the car who got out and started screaming and panicking as the bullet hit the side door, and we stood there petrified, thinking, what the fuck is happening today? We then ran off and sprinted all the way to my house. The area I used to live in back then is one of the safest areas in London. It was by St. Catherine's Docks by Tower Hill, so whoever is from London can relate. Also, gun crime in the UK is very rare, pretty much below zero, so this whole incident just didn't make any sense. I don't know whether it was related to the slow motion thing earlier and the world pausing, but I couldn't help but think to myself that if I had walked there a second earlier, I would have gotten hit. I was driving with my daughter from Atlanta to South Carolina, and we were about 30 minutes away from home. I was very familiar with the area because I've traveled there countless times. As we passed by a church, my daughter said, "Did you see that lady?" I'm like, "What lady?" She explained that there was a woman walking among the tombstones in the graveyard. I'm like, "Let me turn around and see." Now, I had gone just a minute or so down the road before I turned around so that I was sure to see her. As we got to the church, I slowed down almost to the point of stopping, and there was no one. I turned around and actually stopped in front of the graveyard, and nobody was there. Now, this church was very isolated. There were no other houses for at least a mile or two. We didn't see any cars that might have been broken down, and there were woods to the back of the church. Like I said, I know this area, so we think that it was the spirit of a woman who was buried there. You have to ask yourself, why in the hell would a woman be walking around in a graveyard at 3 a.m. in the morning? No houses for miles, no disabled car. Very spooky. By the way, my daughter sees spirits, and she's an empath. I'm from Norway, and I'm fortunate to travel a lot. During my travels, I've seen the same dad and son on 3 different occasions, 3 different continents, in 3 different decades. And they looked exactly the same each time. So the first time I saw them was in New York, back in 1999. I took an escalator in a mall near Times Square. I was going down, they were going up. All 3 of us stared at each other until I reached the bottom, and they, the top. Fast forward to 2009. I'm in Rome with my family, and in a new mall, new escalator. I see them again. They look exactly the same, and I realized that I had seen them before. And we do the same thing. Stare until I reach the bottom, and they, the top. Fast forward again, this time to Dubai in 2019. I'm at the Dubai Mall, and you guessed it, there they are. This time it looked like they recognized me too. They just stared at me different, like they didn't want me to see them. They both looked very serious and almost angry. This time I felt super uncomfortable because I immediately recognized them. And this is 20 years after I saw them the first time, which raises a few questions. First of all, why do I keep seeing them in the exact same situation? Why don't they age? Is it just a coincidence? Why always on the escalator? And why do they stare at me until I'm out of sight? The weird thing is that in the malls I've seen them in, you usually walk around for a few hours, but I've never seen them anywhere else besides the escalator. Also, the son looks to be around 14 or 15. That's why it's so easy to see that they hadn't aged a bit. Kid was still 14 or 15, 20 years later. I have had 2 premonitions up to now. Both happened in 1992, a long time ago, but a year full of disasters in the Netherlands. In both dreams, I was standing in front of a window, observing the disaster unfolding. These dreams were also so vivid that I can still remember them in clear detail. The first one was that suddenly, I was in an office looking outside overlooking a chemical factory. I immediately knew that it was the Sindhu factory nearby. Suddenly, one of the reactor vessels exploded, setting the whole of the factory into flames. A few days later, on July 8, 1992, it did indeed happen. A trainee operator used the wrong recipe for the process. The reactor vessel overheated. The company brigade started cooling the vessel down, but to no avail. The vessel exploded. One of the valves was found 2 kilometers away. The 3 firemen died, and 11 other employees were injured, of which 1 had very severe burns. A few months later, at the end of September in 1992, suddenly I again had a vivid dream of standing in front of a window, this time at the Zilmer area in the southeast of Amsterdam. I saw military planes dropping bombs on a block of apartments. In the early evening of October 4th, 1992, an El Al cargo Boeing took off from Amsterdam Airport, heading to Tel Aviv. Just after takeoff, the captain notified traffic control that they had lost power in 2 engines and requested to return. What he didn't know was that he not only lost power in these engines, he physically lost the 2 engines. I think that they were actually the bombs that I thought I saw falling. The captain had very big troubles in controlling the airplane. He made some circles go up to the point that he could not hold the plane anymore, and it plunged almost nose down into the corner where 2 blocks of apartments met. It left a burning hole of rubble, 8 stories over a length of about 10 apartments, gone. The death toll was 43, of which 4 were aboard the plane. I have since then not had these kinds of dreams anymore. Maybe because both disasters happened within a radius of less than 10 kilometers from where I lived back then. One of my best friends and I really don't know how we ended up in each other's lives. And no, I don't mean in a cutesy, "where did I find you?" type of way. I mean that neither of us remember how we got to where we are in our relationship. We met as teens through mutual friends, but were never more than friendly acquaintances at most. Next thing I know, 10 years later, I'm involved in her wedding. She's a bridesmaid at mine. We're at each other's houses multiple times each week, and I even visited her and her daughter in hospital hours after she gave birth. We are super involved in each other's lives, which isn't unusual for close girlfriends. The problem is that there are big, serious details missing. It's like there's a 2 to 3 year gap where lots of important stuff happened that we just don't remember at all. I don't remember meeting her husband, or buying her house. I don't remember the first time I was in said house. And I don't remember her physically changing, despite the fact that she lost a lot of weight and became very involved in working on her appearance. She doesn't remember showing me her house either, or me being anything other than what I am to her now. We just don't know how we got here. It doesn't seem all that important or mind-blowing, but it really unsettles me when I think about it or when we chat about it. It's like there's something to it that I can't quite put my finger on. We also always joke that we are polar opposites, but there might be something to that. At one time, somewhere between our 2 weddings, I was extremely torn about our relationship. I found her to be so extremely abrasive as a person, but didn't once question the relationship. It's like I just accepted it because she was my best friend. I don't know quite how to explain how it felt. But aside from this, our differences are of the severity that, at the age we were during this gap, we are sure that we would have gotten in the way of us ever being close friends. Was she replaced? Was I replaced? Are my previous memories false? I just don't know. Full disclosure. I have had issues with depression and anxiety in the past, which have their own effects on memory. However, this wasn't affecting me during that part of my life, and I don't have anything similar with any other part of my life. Also, it doesn't explain how we're both on the same page with this.
When I was a little kid, I was pretty much fearless. I was out catching snakes barehanded before I was even in first grade. I got in lots of fights because I never backed down from older bullies. I once climbed up the outside of a 5-story building when I was in second grade just because I looked at the blocks in the corner and thought, I could probably do that. When I was in 4th grade, I lived in a small little one-horse town in Ohio, population 1,500. It was the kind of small town where everyone knows everyone else, and knows everyone else's business. When I was in the 4th grade, my older sister, by 2.5 years, and I went out trick-or-treating. This is back in the days when you could go out trick-or-treating so long that you would have to come back home and dump your bag out at some point before going back out. Everything was going completely normal, and we were having a great time in spite of the fact that she and I don't really get along that well. We came up to a house and knocked on the door. A woman answered. Before we could even say trick or treat, I was hit with such a wave of absolute terror that I immediately turned and ran away as fast as I could. When I got about a block away, my fear had subsided and I realized that I had left my sister behind. When I turned around, she was running toward me, about 30 paces behind. I was embarrassed to admit that I had been scared to death, and simply tried to pretend like I had run away because she did and passed her because I was much faster. I asked her, "Why did you run away?" She didn't seem to realize that I had run away before her, and looked bewildered and simply said, "I don't know, I was scared for my life." Having her admit her fear allowed me to admit mine as well. I had been in many near-death situations and more than once thought that I was going to die, but I have never in my life felt such absolute, complete terror. Neither of us had any explanation for it. This wasn't some haunted house on the edge of town. It was just a normal house on a normal street. The woman who had answered the door did not say or do anything that could have frightened us. She didn't look scary or threatening in any way. She looked just like any other average housewife that would have been in someone's living room in the town at that time. To my recollection, she did not say or do anything at all. She simply opened the door, and the minute we saw her, we were both filled with complete and utter terror. Again, I have no explanation for this, nor does my sister.
I have lived in my apartment for 3 years now, and other than things falling randomly that I would usually blame on my cats, I have never experienced anything paranormal. My boyfriend claims to see white lights at night in our bedroom, but I don't know. I feel there is always a logical explanation for things. Yesterday, I felt particularly spooked in my apartment, and I felt like someone was behind me, like felt a presence. But also, I am a fat baby when it comes to these things, so I never take myself seriously. Anyway, this is where it gets weird. That night, my phone rang. I was expecting a call from my best friend, so I pick up and say hello. What I heard was a doll-like voice, laughing and giggling. She has a 1-year-old daughter who does not sound like that, but I just assumed it was her, so I was like, "Aw, hi." all the while being creeped the F out and wondering what her daughter, who goes to bed at 8, was doing up at 12 a.m. Then it quickly cut to my friend and she was like, "Was that you? What are you doing? Tell me, are you joking with me?" I felt the blood leave my face. I was like, "No, what did you hear?" Thinking she heard the same thing, or maybe some static. She was in shock. She told me she heard a demonic man voice say, "Hello," clearly, and then cut to me saying hello. We spent the next few minutes arguing, as she thought I was joking with her and I thought she was joking with me, even though she was not the type of person to do something like that. We established that it could have just been a weird glitch or something and left it at that. I am so spooked from this, though. Has anyone experienced something like it? I never heard a sound like that in my life, other than maybe in movies. I'm glad she heard something too, because I feel like no one would have believed me. I don't usually get static or anything on my cell phone. Neither of us were watching something on it beforehand, and the sounds we heard were clear as day. Help me find a logical explanation.
I'm going to start this out by giving some background on my mother. She's currently 58, a nurse, and a devoted Christian. Other than the occasional drink, she doesn't do anything to alter her mind. This story begins one day when my mom laid down for a nap. The way she described it, she wasn't asleep, but she began to see a video of sorts repeating in her head as soon as she closed her eyes. She saw a young teenage girl dressed in a schoolgirl outfit, floating away in a boat and waving. My mom could feel her emotions, her sadness and worry for her grandmother as she said goodbye. She could feel that this girl was going to a peaceful place. As well as this, she saw a calendar turn 3 times. This vision repeated itself once or twice, until my mother came to. She thought it was a vision of our family friend Shannon, but it didn't look quite like her. Later on, during the month of March, there was a shooting at a local rave. Shannon's younger sister was shot and killed. She was wearing the exact schoolgirl outfit that my mother saw her in during the vision. The fact that it happened in March means that the calendar was a warning of what was to come. We are unsure of why exactly my mom was meant to see this, but we were able to provide some comfort to the family by letting them know that she was somewhere safe and peaceful. My university was in a remote location surrounded by a river. It was almost like an island. Very isolated, and during the weekend all the locals would go home, making it more eerie. This happened in 2014 when I was 22 years old. My roommate had gone home for the weekend, so I decided to sleep in my friend's room. Around 1 a.m. I woke up feeling thirsty. My friend was studying, so I decided to walk to my room and bring the water bottle as my room was on the other side of the corridor. There was an elevator at the end of the corridor, which played soft music, and you would know if the elevator was on your floor. So I walked toward my room, and as I turned right toward the corridor, I saw an unknown girl staring at the elevator without moving. First of all, I didn't know who she was, because we can usually tell which year a student is, especially after spending 3 to 4 years in the same place and looking at the same faces every day. Secondly, the girl was wearing denim jeans, sports shoes, and was carrying a backpack as if she had just come back from her class. What's strange about that is that the hostel door closes at 8 p.m. The girl was looking straight at the elevator buttons without even blinking. The elevator was still on our floor, so why wasn't she getting on? I could see the side of her face. It was a very strange stare. I don't know how to explain it. I automatically stopped walking after seeing her and got goosebumps all over my body. Something was stopping me from taking my steps forward. I stood there and watched her for about a minute. After that, I went running to my friend's room and asked her if she recognized the lady. When she came back, she wasn't there, and the elevator music was still playing. My friend didn't believe me, and I still don't know who or what that was. In Europe, medieval churches can have grims. Grims are the spirits of animals that were buried inside them to be their guardians forever. I'm an occultist, as in studies the secret properties of things, not will sacrifice your goat to Satan, and a paranormal investigator, and thought that it would be good to pack a grim on a trip to a local church that seems to have attracted some weird entities. So I said a prayer asking for any grims of redundant churches with nothing better to do to pop in when we got there. As my team and I walked through the field ahead of this church, I said the prayer again, and there was a gust of wind contrary to the direction that the wind had been blowing in the whole time thus far. It was also much stronger than the pre-existing breeze. It moved the tops of the nearby trees with an audible whomp sound, and tore away a few loose branches. The gust didn't come from anywhere. It just appeared suddenly where we were. I don't think it traveled far, though frankly I was more impressed with the entrance than watching it. The grim could no longer be heard after a few minutes of trampling the grass, but I assume it was a good thing. This just happened today, and it still got me freaked out. I was sitting watching TV when movement in the kitchen caught my eye, and I looked up to see my husband, who'd been taking a nap in the bedroom, standing in the kitchen doorway, watching me. He was wearing his MASH PJs. I looked at him and said, "You okay?" He didn't answer me, and just kept staring. I turned to put the remote on mute and pause, so I could see if he was okay since he just stood there silently staring at me. It took me about 2 seconds to do that, but when I looked up, my husband was gone. The kitchen was silent, so I got up and went into the bathroom thinking he went in there. The bathroom was dark and empty, so I turned into our bedroom to see if he was in there getting dressed. I about crapped my pants when I saw him still laying across the bed, sound asleep, in his jeans and Realtree t-shirt. It dawned on me then that who I saw in the kitchen hadn't been my husband, even though it looked like him, and was wearing PJs that my husband actually owns, but wasn't currently wearing at that time. I can't figure out what happened, or why or how I saw what I did. If you guys can figure it out, or have a good guess, please let me know, because I'm still unnerved. It was creepy. During the past few years, my gifts of clairvoyancy have developed further, which has created some moments where I truly have questioned my sanity. Former teachers of mine have communicated to me from beyond their grave. 2 of them have led me to where they are buried, and I have predicted 3 district deaths. The first teacher to come through was actually a nurse from the local school, followed by my 6th grade social studies teacher. I was aware that the nurse had passed away in 2012, so I wasn't surprised when she came through. However, I was unaware of the second one passing, and immediately went into denial mode. Eventually, through clues via dreams and meditation, I was able to locate her final resting place. I went from being in denial to being absolutely speechless. I followed the clues that she gave me, and there I was, at her grave. It was at that moment that I realized that what I was dealing with was reality, and that I was not losing my mind. The creepy thing is the numbers of her plot are the same as the numbers in the school district where she taught. As I was visiting her on March 1st, 2017, I had a flash or image prediction about another former teacher passing away, and they would be buried in the same cemetery. On March 6th, another one of my 6th grade teachers passed away, and a few days later they were buried in the same cemetery. The process repeated itself, and he led me to where he is buried. That isn't the only death or dreams, visions that I've had. I've had 2 others. One was in December of 2016, hours after the teacher passed away, and one was in June 2017, 6 months prior to her passing. There seems to be no time structure when it comes to dreams or visions, and the time of passing itself. It ranges in hours after to 6 months before. A couple of months ago I had another dream, and while nothing has happened as of yet, I am very concerned. This happened earlier last week at my sister's house. She lives about 5 minutes from me and has a 1-year-old baby girl who, when she goes to sleep, has a baby monitor in her room to make sure that everything is okay. Anyway, my sister had just finished putting my niece to sleep and I was watching her on the baby monitor. Nothing crazy, and it was during the middle of the week around 7:30 p.m. Well, my sister comes downstairs and we make some small talk while I'm on my phone. Then I randomly decide to check the baby monitor, where there is a clear view of a rocking chair in place about 3 feet away from the crib. I saw myself sitting there, wearing a t-shirt and shorts, looking down at my phone in the rocking chair. I was absolutely horrified, and I screamed to my sister about it, and it scared the crap out of her. I had never seen anything like it in my life, and I didn't know how to react. When I looked up and she came rushing over to check the monitor, I was gone. Nothing, just my niece sleeping in her crib in the dark. The rocking chair, totally empty. Obviously, we had to go and check on her, and I was terrified, and my sister had a bat, but no one was there but her. Nothing was out of place. I wasn't wearing what I had on that night, though. I was clearly wearing a white t-shirt and gym shorts with Nikes on. I had my glasses on and you could see the bright cell phone screen in the dark as I hunched over to look at it. I never looked at the camera but could tell that it was me, and I have not been able to sleep much since then. I can't get that picture out of my head, and the baby monitor doesn't record video, or else I would have gone back and looked. It's probably the craziest thing to ever happen to me in my life. I was not high or drunk or anything like that. It was a normal weekday after work. This may have been a huge coincidence, but last January I applied for my grandfather's military service records. He died in 1981, way before I was born. I applied for his records and didn't think anything more of it. Several months went by, and I assumed that things were just moving slowly. 6 months later, without hearing any news of his records arriving, one night I had a very vivid dream. I don't often remember my dreams anymore. In my dream, I was in a very white, very bare room with high walls and a high ceiling. On a small table in front of me was a box, and inside was my grandfather's military service history. The dream simply revolved around my taking a good look through them. Nothing too exciting. The next morning I wake up and remember the dream, maybe around an hour after I got up. 10 minutes later, a large envelope drops through my letterbox. It was my grandfather's service records. Odd? Just coincidence? A second, much stranger event occurred on the evening when my grandmother passed away. She had passed in the early morning and had been taken to the chapel of rest, which was not too far from the apartment where I was living. That evening, my parents invited me and my girlfriend for a dinner to celebrate her life. In the car, as we drove past the chapel, a leaf landed on the windscreen. The leaf was a perfect heart shape, upside down, so that the light from the streets illuminated the perfectness of the heart shape onto the car's dashboard. The leaf stayed on the windscreen for a minute or so, and right as we turned away and out of our town, it blew off and back toward the chapel itself. I do have a video of the leaf and the heart on the windshield. For a while afterward, shuffling footsteps and noises kept occurring in my parents' house, and they sounded exactly how my grandmother used to walk. We all heard them moving across the upstairs landing. After around 2 weeks, it stopped, and has never happened since. Odd, strangely comforting, and food for thought for a semi-skeptic who finds the subject of the paranormal fascinating. I always visit my son at the cemetery, usually at night. I love how peaceful it is there, and just look at the clear, starry sky. Today has been a rough day for me. I cried and prayed on my way to the cemetery. First, I noticed how bright that the moon is tonight. I usually have to use my phone's flashlight so that I could see where I'm going. Not tonight. My son has a toy box on his grave. Letters, books, and toys are inside. It's a little plastic tote. The lid wasn't there when I got there tonight. It was on the ground. Today's weather wasn't really nice. Everything must be wet, I thought. But no. The card and the letter that's sitting on the very top were dry. The teddy bear was dry. It couldn't have been the wind because the papers were there. I don't know if someone opened it and left it open, or something else. Nothing was taken, and nothing was moved. Tonight, I'm sitting here at the cemetery, totally at peace. I'm going to tell about my experience, but for certain reasons I will not be naming anyone specifically. It was 2014. I was 13 years old at the time, and my great-grandmother was in a nursing home as her mental health had started to slip and as my great-aunt and uncle couldn't take care of her anymore. I remember the last time that I had seen her in person. It was a sunny January afternoon, and me, my parents, grandparents, and my aunt and uncle had decided to talk outside as opposed to the sad, depressing clinical interior of the nursing home. Despite my great-grandmother having memory issues, she recognized me right away and told me specifically hello. It's March of 2014, and during the night, I'm having memory flashbacks of things that me and my great-grandmother used to do, like stringing long strands of old-fashioned buttons, or the time I had my first ever garden-grown tomato raw, sitting on the porch swing with her while my grandfather worked in the field. I remember waking up that morning and asking, almost demanding my mother to call the nursing home, or my great-aunt and uncle, and she called them while I took a shower. After I got done, my mother informed me that my grandmother had indeed passed away from old age. I spent the rest of the day walking around our house in an almost trance-like state. I'm 23 years old and starting to remember this shadowy figure that would appear then disappear in my old family's house. 1 second there would be nothing, then the next instant he would be right beside you. He didn't have a set place in the house. He would always move and walk around the house, and you'd know it was him because you would get this feeling that you weren't alone. He'd be walking beside you or on top of the staircase, just watching. I have to add that he never felt evil. He was definitely not an angry spirit, more like a watcher. I also want to add that I describe him like a man because I remember him being very tall and his silhouette was a masculine shape. Other than that, you couldn't make out his face or anything else. He seemed like he may have been cloaked or hooded sometimes, though. He never did much, just came and left. Everyone, except my younger sister because she was too young, knew about the Shadow Man, but once he appeared to someone who was alone. I should mention that before I was born in 1997 that my great-grandmother on my dad's side had died of old age in the house. She had passed away in the back bedroom, which became me and my brother's room when my younger sister was born. My dad was with her on that night, and says that she saw something. He walked out of the room and came back, and she was dead. Anyways, my parents got married and we moved in 2012, and I haven't seen the Shadow Man since. Whenever I think about it, though, or hear similar stuff, all the hair on my body stands up, and my right eye drops a single tear, every time, without fail. It's even happening as I type. I try to control it, but I can't. I've had other supernatural encounters, and this always happens.
Some weird shit happened to me about a year ago, and I haven't shared it with anyone because I'm afraid they'll think I'm crazy or not believe me. Anyway, at a family gathering at my grandma's house, my mom and I decided to go get some KFC for the family around noonish or so. Once we pulled up to the drive-thru, we waited for a little bit, and nobody was talking to us through the speaker thing. So after waiting, we decided to just pull up to the window. We noticed no one was there, so we thought, okay, fuck it, let's go inside. As we walk up, we see the whole restaurant looks closed, and the doors were locked. Lights are all off, and it's empty. No customers, no employees. There was even a row of high chairs that were put up on the counter, like when a restaurant is closed. We basically said fuck it again, and decided to go get pizza. About 20 to 30 minutes on our drive home from getting the pizza, we passed the same KFC, and my mom sees that it has cars in the drive-thru. My grandma was expecting chicken, so we stopped to get some chicken. Here's where it gets really fucking weird. We walk inside in order, then ask the lady why they opened so late. She gave us a confused look and said they've been open since 10 a.m. As I looked around, there were families who looked like they've been sitting there for a while, eating and chilling. I was so weirded out, I actually asked a family how long they were there for. They were nice people and told me for about an hour. My mom and I have never said anything to anyone, because we still don't know what the fuck happened. I even thought maybe the employees were late, so the cashier tried pulling one on me, but the family made me reconsider that. I don't know. Weird AF. And wondering if anything similar has ever happened to anyone. I used to go to this one church that wasn't too far away from my house. I had gone there for years before noticing anything. One day I was at the church with a friend. It was just her husband, and I. There was no one else in the entire building. We were in the gym, and I heard what sounded like a cabinet door slam in another room. I got up to check and see if anyone else had come in without us noticing, but everything was quiet and empty. I was confused and tried convincing myself that maybe the pastor was playing a joke on us or something like that, though I had no idea why he wouldn't reveal himself if it was him. I walked all the way through the church, never running into anyone else. The next week it was the same scenario. Just the three of us, alone in the church yet again. I was up in the sanctuary, not doing anything important, but just playing around on my phone. I looked over toward the front where the podium was, and noticed what looked like a shadow walking across the room. I'm not sure if these things are easily explained away, or if these were actually paranormal experiences. What do you all think it could be? I had a dream last night that I was being shown a series of gorillas in cages. In the dream, my brother told me that they had developed new technology to allow me to feel the touch of their hands through the cages. Sort of like the suits in Ready Player One. Weird dream logic. Anyway, I'm being dragged through the enclosure and one of the gorillas strokes my head, neck, and back. The thing is, I could actually feel this sensation in my body. I have never, ever felt anything palpably in a dream. My reaction to the sensation was a deep-set revulsion. The creepy thing is that it felt like there was a creature surveying my sleeping body, stroking it like a piece of meat to play with, while imbuing my dreams with an excuse as to why it was happening. Stranger still was that when I opened my eyes after the dream, I could feel this huge hand cupped over my mouth. I felt completely powerless to the creature. It was as though it had little tangible intelligence, but I could feel its feral nature enjoying the moment. It felt like something had lain down behind me in bed. Every time I opened my eyes, I could feel its massive hand over my mouth. Chalk it up to the mind playing tricks, or whatever. It was creepy and intimidating. Last night, I woke up from a vision where my boyfriend bit me right between the shoulder blades. I turned to look at him, but he was deep asleep. The next morning, he told me that he saw a dream where I bit him between his shoulder blades. We were weirded out by this. There was no bite mark on his back, but it hurt like a bitch, by his words. The day starts going by and I notice him acting strangely. I've been working mostly with spirits before, and we live in a very old building with an interesting history, but this was new. He said he can't control his own body, that there is someone else with him. I started to get my stuff to banish whatever there was. I kept talking to him while gathering my things. He wasn't acting like himself anymore. He was very rude, but in a charming way while eating grapes on our bed. I banished the thing, still unsure of what it was. The rest of the day has been normal, and I haven't felt any bad energies, but my boyfriend keeps telling me that the bite between his shoulder blades keeps hurting. Does anyone have any idea what I am dealing with here? About 30 seconds ago, I was sitting on the couch as my dog walked by to go sit on our bed we have behind the L part of the sectional. She had something small caught in her throat last night, I think a popcorn shell, so I was paying attention to her breathing just to make sure that she got it out. For a few minutes, she was breathing fine, and then what sounded like a light snore started happening. This is semi-normal for her depending on what position she's laying in, so I didn't bother to go over and check. That went on for about 5 minutes, until the most disgusting, and to my now realization terrifying, snore, cough, wheezing sound started happening. I go over to her to make sure she's okay. and the exact moment I looked at her bed, the sound stopped, mid-breath, and she wasn't there. She was outside with my parents. Had been for around 30 minutes. There's no way to get out of the room without walking right past me. I don't know whose fucking dog I saw, or what was making that creepy-ass sound 5 feet away from me. But I'm going to be staying outside for the rest of the day, and hiring an exorcist. For a little background, my mother has been in a long-term nursing facility since March with some serious but stable health issues. Then there was a virus outbreak in her facility, and she was diagnosed with it. I of course worried for her condition as she began to decline rather quickly over the beginning of last week. Last Wednesday, I switched off my light at 10 p.m. like most nights, rolled over, and began to doze off. Typically when I'm dozing, my mind will follow some random train of thought that will lead me off into snooze land. That night, as I was dozing, I envisioned my mother walking into my late father's arms, being hugged by my older brother who had died 9 years ago, and having my grandparents and aunt gather around her while being hugged by my father. Then the phone woke me up at 10:30 p.m. The hospice nurse called to tell me that my mother had passed away at 10:15. I like to think that I was seeing her entry into heaven with my family's love and long-missed affection return to bring her to happiness. This happened a couple of weeks ago, and I'm still in disbelief. Little background, I work second shift and get off late at night, where cops are on the hunt for drunk drivers. Quite literally, like the title says, I was driving home from work when I pulled up to a red light. With me at the light was a police officer, nothing too out of the ordinary, but after the light turned and they sped off, I maintained a decent tail on the cop, never taking my eyes off of them. With me at the light was a police officer, nothing too out of the ordinary, but after the light turned and they sped off, I maintained a decent tail on them, never taking my eyes off the car. I cannot stress the fact that that isn't an over-exaggeration, because I for sure did not stop looking at the cop car. Eventually I caught up to the car and boom, it was just a normal car. I never saw another car join us on the road. Nobody passed me, and nobody left the road. The cop car didn't turn off, and I didn't lose sight of the car. I obviously wasn't under the influence of anything save caffeine, which I'm accustomed to. It's honestly freaking me out, still. A few years ago, I was still in high school, and out of my own curiosity, I tried to lucid dream. I started recording dreams for a month as soon as I woke up. I had all of them written out on a big notepad, but I never really got it to work. Anyway, one night I had a dream where a friend came to me right before I woke up, and the only thing that happened was him telling me something bad is gonna happen soon. A few days later, I completely forgot about this, but the same friend in real life keeps acting really just down in the dumps. I ask him what's wrong, and he said it's just a bummer because his uncle had a heart attack and he's worried about him. To add to it, I get a call later that day telling me that my uncle also had a heart attack on the same day and died. At that point, I had to break this weird story to him. Premonition? Or just pretty creepy coincidence? He believes the story, even though I would have been skeptical. I wanted to start this off with a trigger warning.
as it does speak of suicide. There isn't any detail of how this person died, but I know that this subject is hard to read about and listen to for others. Back in 2018, I met a really sweet girl at my church, and we became pretty good friends. We would sit by each other or nearby every service. We attended canned food drives to help others around Thanksgiving. We sat together with a few older couples at church lunches, but we weren't close outside of that. At one point, we had each other's Snapchats before I deleted mine. The week before my birthday, I went to church as normal, ate breakfast with another friend of mine and her kids, and made my way to the sanctuary. I saw Lily sitting on the right-hand side of the aisle, and I sat next to her. We talked for a bit before the service started. However, halfway through, she got a phone call and left. She didn't come back, so I figured that she had had a family emergency or had to go to work early. I finished up at church, talked to my pastor and his family, and then headed home to give a couple piano lessons. Nothing else odd or weird crossed my mind. I just carried on with my week until next Sunday. The following Sunday happened to be my birthday. I was excited because it was my golden birthday, the year of 25. I don't usually like to celebrate, but this was gonna be a good one. I'm a newlywed spending the day with my husband and having my favorite coconut cream pie instead of cake. I still wanted to go to church that morning, though. I love my church and church family and spending time with them. From the minute the church doors opened, everything was off. I went down to the basement and had a cup of cold coffee, a bagel, and I noticed a few people around me who were just pale, cold. I can't even properly describe the sadness on their faces. I'm a pretty introverted person, so I didn't ask any questions. I just went back upstairs to the sanctuary and waited for the service to start. My pastor walked up to the podium with tears in his eyes. He began telling us about how there was a tragedy within the church. Lily had committed suicide the weekend prior, Friday night to be specific. I started crying uncontrollably. I didn't know that she had been dealing with thoughts of suicide, and I felt like an awful friend. We had a beautiful service dedicated to her before her funeral. We all sang songs that she loved, prayed for her mother and family, and prayed for her. I left right after church. I went straight home. I didn't think about the details of her death, because it just hurt too much. A few hours later, though, I remembered the previous Sunday. I had seen her at church. How was that possible, though? She passed away Friday night, but I somehow saw her on Sunday. I sat right next to her. We talked before service started. I watched her answer her phone and walk out. I became angry, scared, disappointed, depressed, every emotion that comes with losing a friend at such a young age. I fell into a hole. After I had grieved and prayed for a couple days, something came to me. My church does live streams, and there would have been a clear view of our service and us sitting next to each other. I logged onto my Facebook, found my church's page, and started searching for the date that I had last seen her. The strangest part of everything is, every live stream is in chronological order, so I figured that it would be pretty easy to find. But to this day, I still haven't found it. I asked the person in charge of recording and uploading the sermons on Facebook where it was, and he said that somehow that there had been technical difficulties that day, and that they were unable to stream the service or even catch any audio. This has racked my brain for months. To this day, I feel as if she had been there on church that Sunday to say goodbye to me. I asked other members if they had seen her the week before, and they all said that they couldn't remember if they had, or they corrected me by saying, "Honey, she passed away last Friday night." There's no way she could have been there. My church is fairly small, and we only have a morning Sunday service, so there's no possible way that I could have gotten my days mixed up. I've had many ghostly encounters in my life. Way too many for me to even count. I'm going to continue to write about all of them, because writing about it honestly is the only thing that brings me peace and sanity. This one hits the hardest, though. I wish I had more answers than I do, or some sort of proof, but I don't. I didn't have any eerie feelings when I last spoke with her.
She didn't feel like a ghost or an apparition. I feel like she was truly there, without a doubt. I hope that one day I can find some answers, or an explanation at least. But for now, I have to keep telling myself that this is how Lily decided to say goodbye to me, and learn to be okay with it. I work in procurement for a large corporation. I meet with a lot of salespeople. In the industry in my area, people move around to different companies a lot. A familiar person came in. I had done a significant amount of business with him at the onset of my career 10 years ago. I said, "Hi, Steve, it's been a while. When did you leave Acme?" He looked confused and said, "I never worked for them." I let it die, and everyone chalked it up as mistaken identity. The problem is that I immediately recognized him. We had spent a lot of time together on a project. His voice and mannerisms were very familiar. I was kind of spooked. Later, I tried to locate my former associate, and I cannot. When I was about 5 years old, I used to have these scary, recurring dreams that always had the same old woman in them. The old woman had gray, curly, short hair, and she was always wearing a creepy black dress with lace on the hems. In the dreams, she would always be trying to scare me. It seemed as though she took pleasure in scaring me. A prominent one that I remember is her sitting on top of me whilst I slept, with a basket of flowers. She would just stare right at me. So only about 3 or 4 years ago, when I was about 16 or 17, that same exact woman appeared in my dream. Same scary vibe and everything. What is super creepy about this occurrence is that I hadn't thought about this woman or talked about her for so many years. It was totally random for that to happen to me. Plus, this recent dream was just as vivid as the others. Almost as though she was visiting me again through her own free will. Another thing that might not have anything to do with the dream is that when I was a child, I had a black dress just like hers that would hang in my closet, and I didn't know where it came from. It always creeped me out because it looked like the scary old woman's dress. I can't remember where I got it, but I might have worn it to my grandmother's funeral, who died when I was 2 or 3. I grew up in a historical town in the UK where there is a cathedral that's over 700 years old. For hundreds of years, people across England and beyond would pilgrimage to it. My family bought a house in this town and decided to renovate it. From the start, I had edgy feelings about the place, but being a generally nervous teen at the time, I put it down to me just being silly. My dad is a total no bullshit kind of guy. Calls a spade, has no time for the paranormal, spiritual, or religious chat. He thinks in terms of logic and realism and trusts what he can see and touch. My mom and him have had some heated debates about the fact that she has seen or felt unexplained things, and he scoffs at that. Basically, if anything spooky ever happened to him, I would believe it purely because he doesn't. I found this out years later. One night, Dad was woken up by the sound of hooves galloping. We slept on the ground floor, but nowhere near cattle or horses, so the unusual noise woke him up. He got up and left the bedroom to look for the source of the sound. He took one step toward the lounge door in front of him and opened it. The lounge door had windows that opened out onto the main road.
Through the window, all he could see were rows and rows of heads walking past the house. The heads had gold helmets with red plumage on them, and they all moved toward the center of town, toward the cathedral. They didn't pay attention to him, but just moved silently through, just their heads facing toward town. We knew the road that we lived on was built on a Roman road, and he believed that these were Roman soldiers on horseback making their way to the city. Over the years, the land would have been built on and up an accumulated height. So in this day and age, all you could see of them was their neck and head.
When I was about 4, I went to the local cemetery with my aunt. She went there often to take pictures because there were some pretty spots there. She was taking photos of my cousins and I ran off, and when they realized I was missing, they yelled for me. I came back and they asked where I had been, and I said that I had been playing with my friend Angel, and that I would take them to her grave. I did, and even though I couldn't read, I told them details about her that I wouldn't have known unless I had been able to read her headstone. Since then I've looked into the girl and found out that she's the sister of some people around my age, who I know in my town. She was 4 when she died. I still look for her headstone every time I go to the cemetery, even today. Last week, at the end of a long shift at a historic hotel, I saw a glimpse of a petite woman with a blonde bob and long beige coat staring up at a wall. It resembled a former manager who had worked there pre-COVID shutdown, but after a second I remembered that she wasn't back to work yet. When I realized this and looked back to where she was, no one was there. My coworker and I quickly scoured the area, but it was vacant. I wrote it off as a benign spirit, as I've experienced some friendly activity there over the years. She just seemed curious or lost. However, I was talking with this former manager on the phone a couple days later, and she told me that she'd just had a dream that she was back working at the hotel and described exactly where she was in the dream. It was the precise location where I had seen the figure. Now, I'm not sure what I believe. My mom and grandma have had similar experiences with premonitions, but I am now 21 and have been having them for the first time in my own life recently. A few weeks ago, I had a very vivid dream about my childhood best friend who I haven't seen or spoken to in years, and I woke up the next day to find out that she had committed suicide. Then this past week, I told my boyfriend that I missed our old coworker who we also haven't seen or spoken to in a few years. And come to find out, he suddenly dropped dead about 15 minutes before I had made that comment. Today I took a nap and had another very vivid dream, very lucid, about my high school boyfriend. And now I'm a little bit freaked out, and I'll definitely be watching his social media over the coming days, hoping that this has just been a weird coincidence.